Hey guys, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I am Cameron Bertuzzi, and joining me today are two distinguished thinkers, Jimmy Akin and Randal Rauser. And what we're doing is we're exploring the recent conversation between Alex O'Connor and William Lane Craig on the slaughter of the Canaanites. And in their exchange, Alex and Dr. Craig, which I've got linked in the description for you guys, William Lane Craig defends the morality of these events, presenting arguments that have sparked both support and skepticism, as you can imagine. And on the other side, Alex O'Connor, with his sort of characteristic posh skepticism, he challenges Dr. Craig, prompting us to call actually biblical morality into question. That's what sort of sparked this stream today. So today we're not just actually reviewing a dialogue, we're actually embarking, hopefully, on an intellectual journey through the complexities of a whole bunch of different things: inspiration, interpretation, history, ethics, and then the profound questions that sort of arise when these different areas intersect. So whether you're a skeptic, a believer, or somewhere in between the discussion, I think today promises to enlighten, challenge, and inspire you. At least that's what our aim is for today. We're going to start this conversation by allowing our guests some time to lay out what the problem these texts pose for Christians. We'll then survey some of the ways that Christians have responded to this problem, and then we're going to turn to review what Dr. Craig has said in defense of his own view. So we've got several different clips pulled up that we will be discussing today. I haven't actually counted, but it looks like we've got about 9 or 10 clips that we're going to play from the discussion between Alex and Dr. Craig, which again, I've got linked in the description if you'd like to see the whole thing for yourself. But we're going to be playing some of these clips, and then Randal and Jimmy will be providing their own thoughts on what Dr. Craig said. Does he provide like a sensible viewpoint here? Is he just completely off base? That's what we're doing today on the channel. So I'm actually super excited. This is the first time Jimmy and Randal, they've both been on the show separately, but this is the first time they've been together. And so I'm actually really excited. Randal, it's great to have you back. It's been a while. Was the last time you were here actually when we were discussing this exact subject, or had you been on more recently than that?
I'm not sure. I think it's probably been about a year.
Yeah. Well, no. I mean, like I said, but either way, it is great to have you back. And then Jimmy was on last week? You were on very recently, so it's great to have you both here. But Jimmy, I'll turn it over to you. I'll let you kind of spell out what this problem is, and then how Christians have responded. And then Randal, he's written a book on this as well, and he's done a lot of the same work here. So this will be very conversational today. But let's turn over to Jimmy first, and then Randal will have you come in.
Okay. So the basic issue is there are various passages in the Old Testament that describe the extermination of peoples who are not simply combatants. You know, the ancient world was a very violent place. There was warfare, and so it was understood in every culture that you had to defend yourself, and that could mean, taking human life. So there was no real question in the ancient world about the use of lethal force. I mean, there might be individual pacifists here and there, but broadly speaking, there was no real question about the use of lethal force when it was necessary. What there was more of a question about is who the lethal force should be directed towards. And there are passages in the Old Testament, particularly in the Pentateuch and in the first 5 books of the Bible and in Joshua, where there appear to be commands from God to use lethal force against entire populations, like the population of a city or a particular tribe or group of people. And it'll include instructions not only to kill the men who are potential combatants, but to kill the women, to kill the children, to kill the elderly, and sometimes even to kill their livestock. Now, these passages tend to be connected with the conquest of the Promised Land. So this is after the Exodus, when the Israelites are on their way back to the Promised Land, and they're displacing the Canaanites who currently live in the Promised Land, or Canaan. These passages rub modern sensibilities very much against the grain, and they can pose challenges for Christians, and they have, in fact, all throughout Christian history, posed challenges for Christians. Some early Christian authors, like Origen of Alexandria, for example, seem to interpret these passages allegorically and tended to not really focus on the issue of would it actually be moral to do this? And they would provide a spiritual meaning of the text that really didn't grapple with the literal sense of the text. But today, people coming from a skeptical perspective will point out these passages to Christians and say, look, your God is abominable. He commands the killing of innocent women and children. And how can that be? And so it's natural then for Christians to try to pose a response, and there are a number of different types of responses that have been proposed today. I tend to put them in the modern responses into three categories. The first category says that these passages are meant to be interpreted literally, and for one reason or another, it was actually okay, it was moral for the Israelites to obey these commands. And then there are different theories about why that would be the case. The second category says, actually, these passages aren't really meant literally. These texts were written sometime after the events that they're describing, and really what they're doing is teaching a moral lesson to later Israelites about the incompatibility of Canaanite paganism with the worship of the true God. Then there's another position, this is sort of the third one, that would say these passages, now both of the first two I mentioned would take the text as being inerrant, not containing error, whether you interpret it literally or figuratively. But then there's a third position that would say the text actually does contain error that is later corrected by Jesus Christ. And so we shouldn't look to these passages as if they were errant, as if they were inerrant. They do contain perspectives that are not morally correct. But fortunately, that doesn't touch the substance of the Christian faith, and we have a correction provided by Jesus Christ in his teaching of love your neighbor.
Yeah, so Randall, let's pull you in here and just get your thoughts on what Jimmy said, his sort of categorization of the different responses. Would you add any different categories, or would you say that that sort of encapsulates the responses that you've seen?
Yeah. So first of all, it's great to be joining you again, Cameron, and you, Jimmy, as well. And I agree with everything Jimmy said. I would, in my book, Jesus Loves Canaanites, so I distinguish between Christians who defend the texts and sort of recognize that they meet a legal definition of genocide, and they take that sort of literal, historical, and inerrant reading. Others that agree with the text and take a literal and inerrant, historical and inerrant reading, but they argue that in fact these texts meet a legal definition that's closer to what we would today call just war theory. So the first group would be someone like Eugene Merrill. Second would be, or John Calvin, I would say as well. So the second group would be someone like Paul Copan, who tries to argue these are inerrant and accurate historical accounts of past events, of what God commanded, but they actually are closer, if properly interpreted, to just war than to something like genocide. And then what Jimmy referred to is this sort of spiritualized reading or allegorizing reading. I agree. Someone like Douglas Earle today explores that possibility. And then the fourth possibility, that there is error within the text. That would be, I would have sympathy with the allegorist approach, but I would also myself be inclined to say that there is error, moral development within the text. And what I refer to it is under the category of providential errancy. So where God has allowed errors in the text to be present, and this is part of whatever reasons God may have for doing that. I think actually there's you get into an interesting conversation in terms of one's concept of what inerrancy is. So, for example, are biblical authors always inerrant with respect to history, with respect to science, with respect to their moral proclamations, with respect to their prudential observations, insofar as those are written into the text? And I think one of the possibilities one has to consider in regard to that is a distinction between the divine authorial voice and the human authorial voice. So the human could be saying one thing, and God, who appropriates the words of that human, could be saying something different than what the human intended. That actually is, I think, a pretty basic observation when you're doing systematic theology, to recognize that there is something different sometimes from what God is doing with the text than what the human is doing. The question is, can you apply that in this context? Just a couple other things I wanted to say. Could I just say one thing about genocide and the definition of it?
Yeah, feel free.
because that gets bandied about, right? And with respect, certainly with respect to the conversation that we're talking about here today. So what is genocide? Well, genocide is technically it's a modern concept that arose in geopolitics, was recognized in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in 1948. And there are 5 key hallmarks that one would look for, which are not necessary. They're not all necessary conditions, but one or more of them with specific intent could be sufficient for a classification of genocide. The core idea of genocide is not just that you're killing mass numbers of a specific group, but that you're trying to destroy the identity of the group as such, whether it's national identity or an ethnic identity, a religious identity, or a racial identity, that you're trying to destroy the identity. And that could be done by killing members of the group, or it could be done by trying to make the conditions of life for them intolerable, or by, let's say, forcibly deporting them to another land and destroying their culture and language. And so certainly, I think at first blush, when you read passages like Deuteronomy 7, Deuteronomy 20, Joshua 6, 1 Samuel 15, Numbers 31, all with respect to the Canaanites, the Midianites, the Amalekites, it looks like the Israelites are attempting to destroy their national, ethnical, religious, and or racial identity. Not racial in this context. I don't think they're racially distinct, but certainly some of these other categories would be met. So it meets the prima facie case for these acts being genocide and thus being considered to be crimes against humanity by modern definition.
Yeah, can I add to that?
Yeah, feel free. One thing I was going to suggest that we do is, before we move too far away, is to categorize where Dr. Craig fits in these different categories that we spelled out.
Sure. I'll be happy to do that, and then I'd like to follow up. So of the different positions that Randall and I have outlined, Craig goes into that first category. He takes these texts literally, and he believes that these commands were actually given to the Israelites at the time of the conquest, and he believes that because of special circumstances, it was moral for the Israelites to obey these commands. So he's in the literalist camp on this. He'll also describe his views once we get into the clips and add more color, but that's the basic category he goes into. When it comes to the terminology that we use to discuss this, as you say, Randall, genocide is a modern category, and it's understood different ways. The normal way that people understand it is killing a particular ethnic group, a genos, a kind of people. And most people would not count simply changing their culture as genocide, because if you did, number one, that doesn't involve killing, which is indicated by the side part of genocide. And it also would mean that Christian efforts at conversion could be considered genocide because you're asking people to change their religion. So I don't find some of these modern definitions particularly helpful. And because the term genocide is inflammatory in our modern context, I tend to avoid that term unless a skeptic deliberately brings it up, in which case I'll address it. But unless it's deliberately brought up by someone, I don't think quibbling about does what's commanded in the Bible technically meet some particular modern definition of genocide adds a lot to the discussion, because there are different understandings of it today. I think the real question is not whether or not these commands involve genocide. I think the real question is, were these things meant to be taken literally, and would it have been moral to obey them? And I think that's the real core of the discussion.
Randall, let's get your thoughts on that particular point that Jimmy makes about defining genocide, whether or not that's even relevant to the whole question, which I take it you probably will provide
we may
a little
differ.
bit of push.
I don't know.
Right. But then we'll move into, as quickly as we can, we'll start to review some of these clips from this interview.
Quick comment I just want to make as well about Bill Craig's approach. I agree with what Jimmy says, but I would say that there is a nuance in the way Bill approaches it versus the way some others have approached it, in the weight of that he places upon the act to drive them out of the land as the primary objective, and the killing of any who remain within the land as sort of a secondary objective, which is different than others who don't make a clear distinction between those two. Now, in terms of the use of genocide as a term, so I think it is important to be clear on terms. That's why when I talk about it, I stick very closely to the 1948 legal definition of genocide, which involves killing members of the group, causing seriously bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And I don't think that's inflammatory. I do think that it carries a heavy moral censure when you use the term, but I think that's appropriate if the acts in question meet the legal definition of genocide, that it should carry a heavy moral censure to go with it. I agree as well that it gets bandied about sometimes in a way where it spreads more heat than light, and so we need to be careful about that. But in terms of the idea of conversion being genocidal, well, if conversion is undertaken at the point of a sword and people are required on pain of death to convert to the other religion, I think you could make a case that that would be a genocidal form of conversion. But take it, neither Jimmy or I would be advocates of that type of evangelical persuasion.
No, definitely not. But as you can see, we've already been having to engage in discussions about what does genocide even mean in this modern definition, as opposed to going straight to the text and saying, here's what the text says. Is it okay to do this or not? By the way, I agree with you that Craig is unique in his approach, or at least he's taking an uncommon approach by saying, oh, well, they could have just left, and really only the ones who wouldn't leave are the targets of the killing orders. Well, I think there's an element of truth in that if a Canaanite fled, and left the promised land, then the Israelites wouldn't have pursued them in order to kill them. But I think Craig is underselling go out, wipe out these people in this town part of the commands. I think there's an element of truth in his position, but he's accenting something that was not really in the Israelites' minds. The idea wasn't, we just want to get them out of the land and we'll tell them to leave, and if they don't leave, we'll kill them. I mean, that's not the approach the Israelites were taking. They weren't expecting them to leave.
Yeah, I know that Cameron probably wants to get to the clip, so I'll just say one more quick thing.
Yeah, no, feel free. Yeah, I think we do have a little bit more time, although so I'll say this really quickly as we transition to these clips here pretty soon. I had one clip about science and philosophy that was actually super interesting. It happens toward the beginning of the interview. We may not get to that one. We may not have time to really get into that. We'll just kind of stick with the main topic for today, but we'll see how far we can get. But Randall, yeah, feel free to provide a last comment, and then we'll play that first clip.
So again, I agree with what Jimmy said there. I would just say a couple things. One is that this came up in the conversation we're about to look at when Alex points out that the Israelites, after the Amalekites fled, not the Amalekites, they fled the city, the Canaanites, then the Israelites followed after them and killed them and then returned to the city to do more killing.
Yeah, he's actually misreading that text.
Okay. Well, and then the other thing that I would say is one of the interesting things that I talk about in the book is that if the Amalekites, if the Canaanites were really as evil and wicked as people like Craig suggest, then one would expect that they would not worry about the least of these in their community, such as vulnerable, elderly people, handicapped, physically and mentally handicapped, infants, children, and so on. They would leave all the people who were least mobile behind as they themselves fled to look out for themselves, which would mean that the first wave of people likely to be killed would be the people likely least culpable or not culpable at all for any of the sins for which the people were being killed, which is, I think, one could argue, a pretty inept way to exert a judgment upon a population.
All right, now let's do this right before we play these, at least the first clip that we've got pulled up here. Actually, we're changing the way that we do things a little bit around here. So super chats that get sent in, we'll try to address them as they sort of come in. We had a couple come in during the beginning of the broadcast. We'll just put these up on the screen and talk about them for a second, and then we'll get into this clip. He says, Richard from Yeshua the King, Richard Dawkins wants to critique biblical quote-unquote genocide while supporting the unnecessary genocide, rape, abuse, etc. humans do to animals. There, I'm not really sure what he is referring to. Jimmy or Randall, do either of you know?
I think grape may be a typo for rape. I'm not sure.
Oh, I see. Or he's just, yeah, it could have been censored if he did use that word. Okay.
This would be a great example, in my view, of where we're misusing the term genocide for rhetorical purposes that's unhelpful. I'm very concerned, certainly, with the way human beings treat animals, but it's not helpful to talk about actions toward animals as genocide. Just like it's not helpful to talk about God exerting punishment on the world population through a flood as genocide. It's not the legal definition of genocide. It's God acting in punitive measures through natural events. And you could have a whole conversation about what that is. But we have to be careful about using the word genocide in a way that's kind of bringing us away from its rooted definition in international law.
Yeah, I would say it's an abuse of the term as well, but I guess we have a difference on whether it's actually helpful to bring a modern legal definition into a discussion of biblical morality or whether it's a distraction.
All right.
Well, one thing we could argue is maybe that you could also say is it's anachronistic. I would say, well, I don't think it is, because genocide was not recognized until 1948, and yet it is applied to events in World War II and events undertaken in Turkey in the teens of the first century of the 20th century. So I don't think we recognize it's an application, but not an inappropriate one. We can say those events meet the legal definition of genocide, even though those events occurred before the term was ratified in international law.
Yeah.
Okay. Jimmy, I'm sure you've got some pushback, but we do need to move on. Sorry.
I was just real quickly, I was going to say, I think I've illustrated my point about how this can become a side distraction. So let's move on.
Yeah, let's move on. Okay, so Gurgly, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. Just says, sorry for the overly inflated currency. Thank you for the topic. So thanks for your support, Gurgly. Hopefully, again, I'm pronouncing that correctly. I have no idea. All right, let's move on to this first clip. Okay, so the first clip is about, Clay Jones. Dr. Craig mentions Clay Jones. Oh, actually, let me, I've got the wrong clip here pulled up. So let me fast forward. 2147, and this is where Dr. Craig mentions Clay Jones's work on the immorality of the Canaanites. So we'll play this clip, and then we'll get some feedback from Jimmy and Randall.
Colleague, Professor Clay Jones, who has done a study of ancient literature coming out of pre-Israelite Canaan, and it is horrific. The culture that is described there. This was one that practiced not only all sorts of human sexual aberrations, but also temple prostitution in the worship of God. They practiced bestiality. There are texts describing how a buck would be strapped down to a wooden frame, and then women would mount the buck and copulate with it. They were engaged in offering child sacrifice to their gods. And so reading these ancient documents that are from pre-Israelite Canaan really bear out the truth of the biblical description of them, though the biblical description doesn't go into that kind of morbid detail that these documents do.
Okay, so unfortunate screen grab for Alex there, but Randall, this is one of the clips that you wanted to comment on, so we'll give the floor over to you first.
Yeah, thanks. So this is Bill's, I believe, referring here to Clay Jones' 2009 journal article, "We Don't Hate Sin, So We Don't Understand What Happened to the Canaanites." So the basic thesis, you could say there in the title, is that if we really understood more how egregious sin was, then we would not have a moral problem with what was visited upon the Canaanites. And first of all, I just think that that's fundamentally wrong, is that what motivates the moral revulsion and concern about texts like Deuteronomy 7 or Deuteronomy 20 or Joshua 6 with the eradication of the population of Jericho, or other texts like 1 Samuel 15:3, where God says, kill all of the Amalekites, including the infants, or in Numbers 31 with the Midianites, kill all the men and the women and the boys, but keep all the virgin girls for the army. What motivates people today is, I think, moral intuitions that those kinds of actions are fundamentally wrong. It's not a failure to grasp the moral gravity of our own sin. Now, the other thing that I would just point out in this article, I think that Jones really cherry picks. So he's looking for shocking references like the one Craig refers to of bestiality, as these are indicative of and represent the entire culture. And the first thing, of course, is that maybe that represented some people in the culture and what they were doing. It doesn't follow that every adult was approving of that or doing that, let alone that every child or infant was doing that. Now, you also see how problematic and Jones's method is in terms of cherry picking, and how concerning the implications could be later on in the essay when he goes on and compares contemporary American society to ancient Canaan. And he argues that contemporary American society is really no better than ancient Canaan because these same sins abound. And as evidence of this, he refers to a 2007 movie in which a plot point is that a woman has a sexual interaction with a dog. And he also cites lyrics from a Metallica song from 1998. And he uses that as cherry-picked evidence that American society today is as evil as ancient Canaan. Now, imagine if you followed the logic of that through and said, okay, God could licitly, morally command the eradication of all the people living in America, forcibly drive them out and kill any who remained, based upon this limited selection of data as to how debased American society is today. People would think that was a moral absurdity. And yet that is similar to what he is proposing with respect to ancient Canaan.
So, Jimmy, any feedback on that before we pull up the next clip?
Well, so I haven't read the article in question, and I, am open to hearing evidence about how morally problematic a given culture is. I agree with Randall. You can't just cherry pick. But there are cultures that have incorporated systematically immoral practices. I mean, for example, if you read accounts of first contact between the Spaniards and the Aztecs, you find, from the Aztec perspective, you find discussions of how, we were trying to make them feel honored, and we brought in the food and we put the blood of our human sacrifices on the food, and the Spaniards freaked out. Well, okay, yeah, that just shows you how embedded in Aztec culture human sacrifice was, and human sacrifice is morally problematic. So here you had a culture that had incorporated extreme morally problematic behavior, and one could argue one way or the other that the Canaanites had done the same thing. It's certainly not going to justify killing babies. That's a separate issue. I think that where this has a role or this discussion of Canaanite immorality has a role, is on the literalist view, explaining why God chose to have the Canaanites removed from the land. Now, as we're going to hear, I assume in these clips, Craig is a divine command theorist. He thinks that things are right or wrong based on divine commands, and these commands flow from, in some sense, God's nature. So he's going to say that that the reason it was okay for the Israelites to obey these commands is that they genuinely came from God. And so they make an exception to the morality that would otherwise apply. You could think of this as the divine exceptionalism position. Craig would say, ordinarily, you can't do this to people. It's only because you got a specific command from God that creates an exception. So this is a divine exception. And then discussion of Canaanite evils helps explain why God made this exception. But the evils themselves would not justify killing children or people who didn't participate in the evils.
One other question I'd like to pose to you, Randall, is what I wonder if facts about the ethics of the ancient people back then, like prior to Christianity, and according to historian Tom Holland, like Christianity has like radically transformed the ethics of like just pretty much the entire world. And so prior to Christianity, ethics was sort of all over the place, and there was a lot of like heinous things, practices, and things in ancient cultures that were going on like all over the place. And so I wonder if those sorts of considerations might inflate the prior probability that the Canaanites would be these sort of morally, corrupt or bankrupt or whatever. So it wouldn't be too surprising if there were a culture to that degree, even given like what you said about like, cherry picking the data and stuff. It could be that he's cherry picked and that the culture of the Canaanites wasn't as morally corrupt as it was. But then again, like, kind of seems like back then there was a lot of morally corrupt cultures, and so it doesn't seem too implausible that there would be one, say the Canaanites, that were just that bad. But what are your thoughts on that sort of thought?
I think the one thing I would want to say is certainly this is talking about the archaeological evidence for life in ancient Canaan and the textual evidence on that is far outside my wheelhouse. But from the scholars I have read who do look at the firsthand evidence, they say that there isn't good evidence that the Canaanites were demonstrably worse or more overtly immoral than other ancient Near Eastern peoples. And certainly one of the things you find in the ancient Near East is a practice of total warfare, where you do go in and it wasn't the Israelites or the Canaanites who were unique in like eradicating entire populations or thinking or boasting about eradicating entire populations. And that's very different than we think about today, when post-World War II ethics of war were very strong on not targeting non-combatants, for example. I think you want to just maintain two things, try to maintain these two things. One is to recognize there's such a sense of objective moral progress, so that we do want to say there's some objective increase in our practices, that they're more moral in some respects than people in the ancient Near East. But you also want to recognize a certain historical perspectivism that in the time and place that you're in, you're going to think like the other people that are living in that time and place. Not surprisingly, you'll be shaped by your culture. So that's pretty much what I would just want to add to that.
Yeah, it does raise an interesting question. I think Jimmy kind of brought it up, and we'll get into it as we go along reviewing these clips. But that is one of the reasons, I mean, it gets mentioned by pretty much everyone, the moral corruptness of the Canaanites. And like, does that provide some sort of justification for removing them from the land? Does it even provide a justification for going out and like slaughtering them or removing them? Or, if it does meet the definition of genocide, does that justify it? And I think that raises a very interesting question. Apart from whether or not they were actually that bad, does that actually provide some sort of justification? But I'm sure that we'll get to addressing that as we kind of go on. There's a lot more clips to get to. So this next clip is Jimmy mentioned divine command theory. This is a clip about divine command theory from Dr. Craig. He's sort of explaining his view here. So let's listen to this clip, and then we'll get some more thoughts.
In consistency with his own nature. And so when you think of it in those terms, Alex, the problem posed by the conquest narrative is as follows. It's very similar to the problem of evil, that there is a sort of internal...
It looks like we've got the wrong timestamp here. We didn't get enough from him on divine command theory. Let me back up a little bit and see if we can get a little bit more.
Perfectly good nature, his own just commands to himself as to pull over. Then, in virtue of his authority, I would have a legal obligation to pull over and obey what he's done. And so the theory is that moral obligations arise as a result of imperatives issued by the paradigm of goodness himself, who is God. Now, presumably, God doesn't issue commands to himself as to what he should do. And therefore, on this theory, God has no moral obligations to fulfill. And therefore, as you rightly said, it's impossible that God could do something wrong, because right and wrong are defined by divine commands, and God doesn't issue commands to himself to obey. So what constraint is there then on the moral commands of God? Well, it will be his own perfectly good nature, his own just and loving nature, that will determine whether or not a command is available to him. Now, what this means is that there are lots of actions then that God can perform that would be prohibited morally to us. For example, you wouldn't have the moral right to kill me. But if God wants to strike me dead right now, that's his prerogative. God takes and gives life as he wills. So if God wills to end the life of the Canaanite children prematurely, that's his prerogative. So God doesn't have the same sort of moral constraints that we do because he doesn't have moral obligations to fulfill. He has to act only in consistency with his own nature. And so when you think of it in those terms, Alex, the problem posed by the conquest narrative is as follows. It's very similar to the problem of evil, that there is a sort of...
I think that's an interesting point, but did we cover the sort of clip that you wanted to address here, Randall?
Yeah. Sorry if I didn't give you an exact timestamp. So if you just went off my approximation, that's on me. I should have just said it's at 26 minutes and 32 seconds or whatever, and so that's on me. So Craig was talking
Randall.
about. I know. Yeah. So we're probably gonna have that problem later on too, but.
The other one that I've got from you is 37:30, so hopefully that one's somewhat accurate. We'll see.
Ish, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I would agree. So first of all, I think that there's a Craig here. So I think it's helpful to distinguish between moral values and moral obligations. So moral values, good and evil. Moral obligations involve right and wrong. And typically, I would say divine command theory is a theory of moral obligations, not moral values. It's not like God creates good and evil as a volitionally out of his will, but rather moral value, typically understood, as Jimmy said earlier, in some way essentially related with the nature of God, grounds the nature of the good, and then God's obligations constitute or God's commands constitute or are somehow linked essentially to our obligations in respect to that moral value. And I would say that I'm a divine command theorist. The key thing to, although I say as well that, I don't lose sleep over metaethics, but I would say that that's probably where I would hang my hat. But I think one important thing to address here is how one becomes aware of the commands that God has issued. Let's say a command, maybe it's a specific command to go and do this thing, or it's a general command to love your neighbors yourself. How do you become aware of the divine commands that God has issued? And I think there's a common misperception that people often have when they hear about divine command theory, that one's moral knowledge of divine commands originates because God has some special revelation that he gives to a specific individual and says, I want you to do this. But it could be that most, if not all, of the divine commands that we have knowledge of come, let's say, through moral intuition and reflection, through natural law, so through something like that. So it could be a very different way that we come about to have knowledge of divine commands. So when I wrote my book, it had a very strong emphasis upon the pivotal nature of moral intuition. In fact, maybe I'll just read a quick quote from Eleanor Stump on this regard, and then turn it over to you and Jimmy. So in the book, I quote from Stump. She's just quote the end here. She says, "Our original intuitions retain an essential primacy, like in our moral reflection." And then she says this: "If we found that our ethical theory countenanced Nazi experiments on children, we'd throw away the theory as something evil itself." So we start off with these basic moral intuitions, and then when you do ethical theorization, you're trying to have ethical theory that, for the most part, can hopefully vindicate and maintain your intuitions, although at times there may be a critique of those intuitions. But there are some intuitions, as she says here, like Nazi experiments on children are fundamentally always evil. Well, then your theory, whatever it's going to be, has to condemn that. And I would argue the same when it comes to things like slaughtering civilians in war. But what I would say is that for me, that basic moral intuition is my knowledge of a divine command to always respect human life and protect innocent and vulnerable human life. So you could have a divine command theory, but nonetheless have one that's consistent with your moral intuitions rather than one which is steamrolling them.
Jimmy, yeah, feel free to provide any thoughts
Yeah.
on that. I mean, I've done some thinking on it as well. I don't necessarily count myself as a divine command theorist, but I do have some thoughts on the way that Dr. Craig sort of defends this through divine command theory. But Jimmy, feel free to share your thoughts first.
Yeah, thank you. I actually have quite a few. We're kind of at the core of Craig's defense, and I have a number of thoughts about it. I think that there are elements of truth in what he's saying, but I think he's articulating them badly. One of the things that he, in describing himself as a divine command theorist, he says that what commands God can give is constrained by God's own nature. And that gets us into a kind of natural law area where, for humans, the natural law is based on human nature. For God, the divine natural law is going to be based on the divine nature. So if God is all loving, for example, then how can God give a command that appears to be unloving? And I don't think he adequately wrestles with that issue. I think that Craig makes it sound more like God can just command almost anything, because he says God doesn't give commands to himself, and therefore he's not constrained in terms of what he can order us to do. Well, no, I think that rubs the language of the Bible against the grain, because the Bible does envision God as having moral obligations. Abraham confronts God and says, "Will not the judge of the earth do right?" And God has also, based on the way he set up the world and human nature and the covenants he's made, he's got obligations to fulfill those things. And it would be wrong of God not to do that. Now, he won't fail to fulfill them because he's all good. But I think that simply saying God has no moral obligations is not a promising avenue. I think that Craig also is stating his case badly when he just says, well, God could order this because he doesn't have obligations, and therefore it's okay for us to kill kids. I think that a much better way to say it, and he does say it to some degree, but I think it can be polished, is to say, look, if we're taking the literalist view of these texts, and personally, I'm not a big fan of the literalist interpretation, but I'm going to assume it, since it's Craig's position, I'm going to assume it for purpose of articulating this. Look, all life is a gift from God. In fact, existence itself is a gift from God, and certainly physical life is a gift from God. Given that it's a gift, it's up to God to determine how much of that gift we receive. He's not doing us any injustice if he were to simply cease to maintain us in existence and we just cease to exist. So if existence is a gift from God, and if physical life is a gift from God, and if it's up to God to determine how much of these gifts we receive, then God can choose to say, okay, in the case of these Canaanites, I'm determining that that the gift I have given them will run out at this time. And I also, as the creator, can determine the means by which that gift runs out. And therefore, God would be within his rights to say, okay, Israelites, I'm displacing these people in favor of you because of their sins. I want you to wipe them out. And that's not framed in terms of human morality and what it's just for a human to just what it's righteous for a human to choose to do with respect to another human. This is an understandable divine position where it's God simply saying, okay, I gave them this amount of the gift runs out at this time because of their sins, and here's how that gift is going to run out. And I think that's a better way of putting it than what Craig actually does. So I think that he has elements of truth in his position, but I think he's not fully balancing them properly, and I think you can express his case better than he actually does.
Yeah, I was going to share my thoughts, but I think I'll hold off on it because the next clip, he gets into God allowing children to die so that they can go to heaven. I think that's kind of like where a lot of people, when they hear that, or at least that part of Craig's view, that's where they start to be like, this is really bad. Like, how could you? Mm-hmm. And then you start to think about other instances of people who thought they heard God and then like literally killed their children. There are actual people who have done that. And and that's where people's minds go. And like you said, Randall, we've got to weigh these moral intuitions. What do we think is most solid when we think about morality? And yeah, I mean, to allow for, if your moral theory allows for something like that, that's where people start to be like, okay, well, maybe we need to abandon that moral theory. And that's why people, I think, are reacting the way that they are to this interview and to Dr. Craig's views, which actually, if you've like been following Dr. Craig's views and his thoughts on this topic, he in this interview doesn't reveal anything new that he hasn't already said. Like, this is stuff that has been on the internet since like 2007 was like the first question of the week that he took on this topic. And so he's developed a little bit since then in terms of like he now I think as a result of like an updated question of the week, he denied that it qualified as genocide. But for the most part, like his views have been out here for a while. It's just that now this interview came out and people are kind of hearing his views widely now, and that's why people are kind of getting upset about it. But let's turn to this next clip, and then we'll get into this. Is kind of like the meat, because Dr. Craig says here that really the issue is about the children, because that seems to be the most problematic thing about this account, which I actually have some pushback on that as well. So that I think that there's two issues, but let's play this clip first, and then we'll get some thoughts on it.
Yes, and as I say, I affirm that moral intuition. If these actions had been undertaken in the absence of a divine command, it would be objectively wrong. But the point would be is that on a divine command theory of ethics, God is free to issue a command that goes against that, so long as it is consistent with his just and loving nature. And so the burden here would be to show that in issuing this command, God does something that contradicts his perfectly just and loving nature. And my argument is that that's very difficult to show because he doesn't wrong anyone, I think, in this. In particular, the difficult case here is the children. And what I would say is, first, that God has the right to take anyone's life whenever he wants to. Unfortunately, children die all the time in infancy. And so if God wants to end the life of these Canaanite children early, prematurely, that's his prerogative. But then secondly, on my theology, these children go immediately to heaven. They go to be with God, and therefore come to know a life that is more glorious and more happy than anything conceivable, and certainly far better than if they had been allowed to live and be raised in such a corrupt and evil environment as they were in. So it was actually a tremendous blessing to these children for them to be killed and go to heaven and be with God.
You must.
Yeah, and then Alex, I mean, I wish he provided some more pushback on this, because he kind of responds and says you can see how that sounds to people, but that to me is not enough pushback. But so I think one of the things that Dr. Craig says here is that the real issue is the children, like what to do about them, the slaughtering of the children. The adults, he seems to think that's like permissible because of how morally corrupt they were. But I think it still raises the question of like, even if it's not technically genocide, the term ethnic cleansing, which is another of these more recent like modern terms that have been developed. I think, I don't know the exact date. Jimmy, you can help me with the exact date that term was actually coined.
It was in the 1990s during the Yugoslav wars after the fall of the Soviet Union that the term ethnic cleansing came to prominence.
But that term, essentially all it means is forced deportation. And so I think the question still remains, like, even if this group of people were really, morally bad, is it morally permissible to forcibly remove them from the land? I think that's a genuine moral question, as opposed to just saying, well, they were so bad, you just can remove them like no matter what. I think it's still a question that needs to be grappled with, and you can't just like be like, well, they were so bad, it justified it. I think there's still a question there. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is about the children, and what it sounds like Dr. Craig's view is, it almost sounds like a sort of caricature of the soul building theodicy. And that caricature goes something like this. Soul building is really about, because within soul building, for those of you that don't know, soul building is a sort of theodicy, or like a reason God has for allowing suffering in the world. And this theodicy says that there are these great virtues that can be produced in the midst of suffering, like courage and sacrifice and stuff. But usually what happens with this theodicy is that it's coupled with heaven. And so on heaven, and obviously Craig mentions it here as well, the children immediately go to heaven and they're with God. And so in some way they're sort of, the term here is compensated. They're compensated for the badness that they experienced. And so it's almost like Craig is suggesting that it was worth it. It was like they were compensated for the wrong that was done to them. He may quibble with that. He may say that they weren't wronged at all. But I think that there's an analogy that can be used here to explain, I think, what a lot of people's intuitions are sort of highlighting. Like, there still seems to be something wrong with this situation. And I think here, this analogy might help. So suppose that you like walked up to somebody, you broke both of their legs, and then you just immediately gave them like $1 million in compensation for that. And you're like, well, look, you're way better off now than you were before. Even though your legs are broken, you have $1 million. And I think that's where people are going to be like, well, no, it was still wrong of you to break their legs. Like, that was still wrong. Even if they got a whole bunch of money afterwards and were compensated and maybe even had like a better life afterwards. And so you still got to make that consistent with like, and then suppose that you want to say that this person who broke their legs and then gave them money, their nature was such that they were perfectly loving and that they broke their legs out of love. You'd still want to be like, well, how was that loving? Like, did they need to break the legs? And so the analogy would be, and Randall, I think you talked about this on Twitter, is that it's not as if God just sort of, with these Canaanite children, it's not as if God just like, in the middle of the night, they stopped breathing and didn't have any experiences or didn't experience any pain. What happened is that God commanded the Israelites to go and slaughter them, to go and kill them. And so whatever means that they used in order to do this, that is what happened. And then on top of that, it's not like Dr. Craig also mentions, and I know I'm kind of going a while here, but Dr. Craig also mentions that God can sort of take life whenever he wants. And, there's a lot of children that die in childbirth. There's a lot of children that die from cancer and other natural diseases and stuff. But I think another thing that sort of makes these Old Testament atrocities sort of stand out for people is that when it comes to like natural disasters, or say something that God might quote unquote allow to happen, as opposed to actively going out and like telling someone, hey, you need to go and perform this really bad thing. There's a difference there. There's a moral distinction, I think, between allowing something to happen and commanding that bad thing to happen to that person. And so I know I'm kind of going all over the place, but that's where my mind went when I was hearing Dr. Craig sort of spell this out. I think that there's still some issues that need to be grappled with here. Like, just to sort of reiterate here, Dr. Craig says, well, he didn't wrong the children because they go to heaven. But going back to that analogy, you can still wonder, like, why issue a command like that that's going to harm the children and then compensate them? That you've still got to, on Craig's own view, you've got to make sense of how that works with divine love. And it's not all that clear from the way that Dr. Craig has spelled it out that his view makes sense of that it's obvious that the command that God has given here is made out of love, even if you want to compensate them later on with eternal bliss or heaven or whatever. So I suppose that those are the two thoughts were about the children, and then also ethnic cleansing or forced deportation, whether or not that's ethical, which I think We can maybe discuss that a little bit, but the children obviously is one of the more controversial points. But either way, yeah, Jimmy, go ahead and come in.
Yeah, so let me try, even though I'm not a huge fan of Craig's theory, let me try to steelman it. So I think the reason that he brings up the children and says this is kind of the core of the issue is he's trying to steelman the opponent's argument, because the adults are moral agents and therefore they can in some way be held responsible for the consequences of their moral decisions. But the children aren't. They're not moral agents, and therefore they shouldn't be held accountable for the moral decisions of their parents. So the children are the most difficult part of the argument to deal with. So I think that's why he brings it up and says it's the core of the argument, because it's the most difficult part for him to respond to if a skeptic challenges him. If he's challenged on, well, what about the women? Well, they were part of their culture. They made decisions. If they're copulating with animals, well, then they can be held accountable for that. But kids, there's no question. So I think he's trying to steelman the argument by focusing on the children. When it comes to the children, I agree that I think that there's a mix here. I think he's correct that if all children go to heaven, then the Canaanite kids are going to go to heaven. They're going to have an infinite good as a result of everlasting life with God, and that is going to outweigh the damage that was done to them. If you have a few minutes or at most a few hours of terror as Israelites are killing your people and you're aware of that as a small child, that's a finite evil, but God is going to give you an infinite good. So I think that he's correct about that. And St. Paul does talk about how the sufferings of this life are not worth comparing with the weight of glory that God has for us in the next. So I think this is a legitimate move for him to make. But I think you're correct, Cam, that what he hasn't done is explain why this means to getting to that end. Because if you just break somebody's legs, hang on just a second, my device was talking to me. If you break somebody's legs and then give them $1 million, we sense there's something messed up about that. That's disordered. That's not loving. There's something wrong there. Now, I could imagine, I needed to break your legs because some supervillain had put uranium pellets in them and I needed to get the uranium pellets out so that you don't die of cancer. Well, that's different. In that case, the evil of breaking the legs has a legitimate function. And so it actually would be merciful and loving to someone to break their legs in that situation, as fanciful as it may be. So what Craig needs to do is do something to explain why was this means, killing these children, why was that necessary? And I think that there are a few things that he can say here, essentially 3. I'll be real quick. First one, and this is at least the Catholic perspective, but I think it's going to be shared by many Protestants, God would not allow any evil in the world unless he was going to bring a good out of it, an equal or greater good. Therefore, there must be some equal or greater good that God was bringing about by the destruction of these Canaanites on the literalist interpretation. We can then speculate about what was that good. And one leading speculation be that it was protecting the Israelites from contamination with pagan immorality. We already know from the Old Testament that many Israelites fell into pagan immorality. They were Israelites later on committed child sacrifice. They had human sacrifice going on at the Tophet in the Valley of Hinnom, right next to the Jewish temple and within sight of the temple. They had altars to pagan gods in the Jewish temple. So this paganism and its immorality, including child sacrifice, was an extreme temptation for the Israelites for many centuries down to the time of the Exodus. And so at least part of the good that was coming out of the physical evil of the destruction of the Canaanites was going to be the protection of the Israelites, God's chosen people, from this moral and religious contamination. At least that's what someone coming from Craig's position could say. The third thing that I think he could say about why this means is because of the cultural conditions of the time. He's not dealing with modern people. He's dealing with ancient Near Easterners. And as Randall mentioned, ancient Near Easterners practiced total warfare. This was in part because they didn't have police forces and nation states at the time. When you had rival clans, which is essentially what we're dealing with here, you had rival clans, and when they would battle, it would be extermination. Because if you left people from the other side alive, they're just going to come back and attack you in a few years. And so all ancient Near Easterners tended to practice total warfare and warfare of extermination. So God, at this period in history, is dealing with a blunt instrument. Israel is not yet trained in God's ways. This is the beginning of Israel's walk with God. And as Jesus said in Matthew 19, God tolerated certain things about the Israelites because their hearts were hard, because of how they thought about things like divorce, for example. Well, this could be another example of that, of how the Israelites thought in terms of total warfare and warfare of extermination. They even had a term for it, cherem, which in Hebrew it's sometimes translated devoted or placed under the ban, but it's a reference to this kind of sacred warfare and sacred destruction of things. Well, this is how they thought, and so God used this pattern in their culture. Even though it's a blunt instrument as a culture, it's not surgically precise in dealing with the problem, but because it's how ancient Near Easterners thought, God tolerated the bluntness of this means of accomplishing the end. So if I was in Craig's position as a literalist, that's how I'd argue his case.
Randall, let's pull you in now. We've been going quite a while. So any thoughts that you've got on this clip?
So my first takeaway from the conversation is that if someone has uranium pellets injected into their legs, that's a morally sufficient reason to break them. So,
yay, we're in agreement.
I love how you just pulled that out of the air. I would never have come up with that one. So, but yeah, to actually to tie into that. So Cameron, when you're saying, well, like the payment that, $1 million, whatever, doesn't justify breaking the legs. I'm sure Craig would agree. The reason why it's right is because God has given a command to do it, and then the money or the afterlife is just an additional bonus. But that's not the thing that makes it right. So it's not a kind of utilitarian ethic in that regard. So some of the other things I wanted to talk about. So at the beginning of that clip, Craig argues that his account aligns with moral intuitions. And he seems to say that our moral intuition isn't that it's wrong to kill children, but that it's wrong to kill children in the absence of a divine command. And I just think that's flatly wrong. Our moral intuition is that it's wrong to kill children, not that it's wrong to kill them in the absence of a divine command. So I do think that counts against his view, and that his view is really requiring us to take, I think, a radical error stance with respect to the reliability of some of our most fundamental moral intuitions. That they are in fact wrong, that there are circumstances where these things that we think are categorically wrong are in fact morally obligatory and praiseworthy, such as if God has commanded those actions. Now, another thing I think is really hugely important here when we're thinking about the killing of children and so on, is that we focus on a thick narrative description. That really helps us to fine-tune what our moral intuitions are about that issue, and thus what the evidential weight that we may have from those moral intuitions is. And the irony is that I think people like Bill Craig and evangelicals generally and Catholics, that we understand this idea. So for example, when people who are pro-life talk about abortion, it's very common for them to talk in detail about an abortion procedure and what that does to a developing human fetus. And part of the reason for doing that, for talking about what a D&C abortion does or what a saline injection abortion does, is to help people to understand the moral gravity and weight of what we're talking about and to trigger those moral intuitions so that people can make an informed moral judgment about the ethics of the action under question. And we simply have to provide that same modus operandi when it comes to evaluating the ethics of killing children in warfare. So rather than give these stripped down minimalist accounts of God no longer maintaining the life of a human being, we have to consider, as Cameron alluded to earlier, as I had mentioned on Twitter, thick narrative descriptions of what that would have looked like. And that's why in my book on the topic, I spent a lot of time comparing at multiple points that which is described in Joshua, with that which occurred in Rwanda in 1994, to help us to fine-tune what our moral intuitions about these issues are. Now, another thing that Craig doesn't talk about is what is often called the age of accountability. So he says, well, the children go to heaven. Yeah, until what point, right? Craig, I believe, would hold to this age of accountability view that at some point you are morally culpable for not being in relationship with God in Christ. And thus, if you die in that state and you've now passed the threshold of accountability, you do not go to heaven. You, in fact, go to a place of eternal torment. So at what point does Craig place this age of accountability? Is it the Canaanite child who's 5 years old, who's 8 years old, who's 14 years old, and killed by the Israelite sword, who then goes to a place of eternal torment? And I think that's some important bit of information that we should know. So all of those are things that I think that I would want to consider with respect to Craig's position.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing for me would be, I'd like to hear more from Dr. Craig on what is sort of going on in his mind in terms of how these commands of God's are compatible with his loving nature. Like, what is it? What are the additional facts about the situation that make it such that it's a loving command to order the Israelites to go and kill the Canaanite children? And I know that, Jimmy, you alluded to like some possibilities, but I think that's what's sort of missing for me from Dr. Craig is like some sort of concrete, reason or answer that he's gotten. And maybe it's just a matter of like he doesn't have one, and so he wants to put the burden back on the other person and be like, well, you've got to pinpoint a reason why he doesn't have a loving reason to order these sorts of commands.
So based on what Craig says, if I can put myself in his position and imagine what he would say, I think he would say, well, God, these are loving. I mean, I'm not saying this is my position. I'm saying this is what I think his position is. This is loving for the Israelites because God loves his people and is trying to protect them from paganism. And it's loving for the Canaanite children because they get to go to heaven. And for those above the age of accountability, it's even loving for them because it's stopping them from sinning further. Yeah. So even if they go to hell, it's going to be a better hell than they would otherwise have.
Can I just add something as well about a justification? So, I mean, I think in passages like Deuteronomy 7:4, the message is that if you do not eradicate these people from the land, they will turn your children away. And so you will be corrupted by them and by their taint, and you will no longer be fit to carry out the missional purposes for which I've intended for you, which goes back to Genesis 12, right? To be a blessing for all nations on the earth. So I think certainly part of the story could be not just that their sin was so heinous and they're sacrificing children and so on, but that this would impact you and you would no longer be able to carry out these purposes for which God had called them. So an apologist for that perspective could argue that this is really for the benefit of all humanity. And that's one of the reasons why some of the people who take this defensive stance would argue that this was for a unique time in history, this period, to maintain the fidelity of these people at this time. Now, one of the quick pushbacks I would just get is I think there are a range of things God could have done to protect the integrity of his people apart from mass slaughter.
All right, let's do this. So change things up a little bit and take some of the super chats that have been sent in. So this one from, whoops, I've got the wrong thing hidden here. Let me see.
By the way, Cameron, before, I know we talked about going an hour and a half. Before we get to the end, I think it would be good if we spent at least a few minutes talking about alternatives from a Christian perspective to the kind of position that Craig is arguing.
Sounds good. That sounds good.
Whenever you like.
Another thing is that Randall's got a pretty hard cutoff at in about 20 minutes, but Jimmy, you've got a little bit more time, so we could actually spend a little bit more time going through some of the clips if you are
sure.
If you're still available. Okay, and then Randall will just have to bounce, and then it'll just be me and Jimmy. All right, let's get some of these super chats in here from Carolina D. Dr. Kip Davis is in the chat. Can you please discuss his points and bring him on the live? I think it's important. So actually, I don't know much about Dr. Kip Davis. I've seen his name pop up on, I think it's Myth Vision. I don't know much about him. I have seen some of his comments in the live chat, but that's not like something that we do normally, is just like pull people in for shows. I normally vet my guests and plan everything out in advance and everything. So that's not to say that his thoughts aren't worth considering or addressing or anything like that. That's how I kind of roll here, is I kind of plan everything out. So, yeah, that's that. Thanks for your super chat. All right. Minds on Guard. Interested to hear what your thoughts are on this. When will anyone in these discussions address the supernatural worldview in the Genesis 6 context, which is about the flood narrative? To not do that is to not properly frame the context of Scripture.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on this?
So I'd be happy to address that. What Minds on Guard is referring to is a view that has been popularized in recent years by Michael Heiser, who was an scholar of the Old Testament and ancient Near Eastern literature. He's a really nice guy. I knew him, and I think there's a lot of merit to things that Mike proposed. One of the things he proposed is that the sons of God in Genesis 6 are actually angelic beings who mated with human women, giving rise to a line of people who were giants, and that these giants then, and the same thing happened after the flood, and that these giants then had descendants that were among the Canaanites. And so Mike, and I think a lot of that is part of the Old Testament worldview. But Mike then proposed that the commands to exterminate Canaanites are specifically oriented towards getting rid of these corrupt descendants of the giants. And I think it's an interesting proposal, but I don't see a good evidential basis for it. Because it doesn't tell us that these specific peoples in any clear way were descendants of the giants. Even if it did do that, though, I don't think it resolves the moral problem. Even if the Israelites were meant to get rid of these partially human, or mostly but not completely human peoples, you still can't kill babies, even if they're hybrids. If they're able to grow and think like humans and interact with humans and mate with humans, which they obviously were, because as Randall has pointed out, their DNA is still with us today. Canaanite DNA is still in the world. Then it's not really going to solve the moral problem. It may color why the Israelites were doing this, if Mike's thesis is true, but it's not going to resolve the moral issue.
Randall, any thoughts before we move on to more clips?
Just a couple quick things. So first of all, David Livingston Smith wrote a book a few years ago called Less Than Human, and he looks at the history of genocidal killing of people going back centuries. And these are the common elements to justify eradicating a population of human beings, is to say, well, they're somehow less than fully human, they're not like us. So from a historical perspective, to say, well, the ancient Canaanites were really Nephilim descendants, they were not fully human, so it's morally justified to eradicate them. I think people are rightly skeptical of that, because that just fits into this common pattern of rationalization for these kinds of killings. And yes, as Jimmy said, we have the DNA of the descendants of Canaan, particularly believe in people of Lebanon. And there's no evidence there that it's different than any other human DNA, nor is there evidence, to my knowledge, of the skeletal remains of giants in the region. And one would expect that if they were really substantially larger and more intimidating than other humans, then there would be some evidence for that. So I think one of the problems with Heiser is I think he's very good at articulating what some of the worldviews of the ancient peoples were. Where I'm sort of scratching my head as a systematic theologian is arguing that we go from the description of what they believe to the normative expectation that we ought to believe that as well. That's another question.
Yeah.
I think that's a weakness with Mike's stuff. He's good on what did ancient people believe, but then he tends to neglect how do we integrate that today. By the way, on the subject of giants, the biblical giants weren't that much bigger than us. In fact, they're the same size as a lot of modern humans. But I did an episode of Mysterious World on that where I interact with all this. So if you're interested, it's episode 243 at mysterious.fm/243.
All right. I think what we'll do now, I was thinking, Randall, we could do some more clips, but we're actually coming up against the end of our time, I think, with you. So let's do what Jimmy suggested and look at some of the alternatives to Dr. Craig's view here.
Who would you like to go first?
Let's Jimmy, since you suggested it, we'll go with you, and then we'll get Randall.
Okay. So everything that I've been articulating thus far has been based on a literalist understanding of these texts, that they were literally given to the Israelites at the time of the conquest, and it was somehow okay because of the circumstances for the Israelites to obey them. But those aren't the only positions that are available to Christians. Another position that I mentioned is what Randall has called, I believe, providential fallibilism or providential errancy, where the Old Testament is allowed to incorporate mistaken perceptions, including mistaken moral perceptions, as part of the development of God's people. And if that's the case, now I don't favor this because I'm an inerrantist, but some Christians are errantists, and they could easily say, well, these passages are just mistaken. These incorporate an ancient Near Eastern perspective, but it's not God's ultimate will, and God's ultimate will is revealed to us by Jesus Christ, who taught love your neighbor without exception, even love your enemies. And that's inconsistent with these passages. Therefore, we shouldn't regard them as normative for the Christian faith. They may be things that ancient Israelites did and believed, but they're not normative for us. And there are various people who've proposed things like that. The other major category, which I tend to favor, is one that says these passages are not meant to be read literally. All of these texts, whether it's Deuteronomy or Joshua, were written hundreds of years after the events in question. So they're looking back, the biblical authors are looking back on those events and to some degree reconstructing what happened, because they didn't have tape recorders back then. They didn't have stenographers taking down everything that everybody said. So there's a degree of reconstruction going on in these texts. And the question is then, well, what message was the biblical author trying to communicate to his audience? Now, to some degree, that's going to depend on when you date these documents. A lot of scholars would date them like Deuteronomy and Joshua to like the 600s BC. I would put them earlier than that. I'd put them around 1000 BC, but they're still hundreds of years after the conquest occurred. And so this is not a live situation for the biblical audience. And what I would propose, and others have proposed, that the biblical author is trying to do is communicate to his audience the radical incompatibility of paganism with the worship of the true God. And to communicate, you just need to cut out everything that's connected with these former practices that you've heard about that the Canaanites were doing, or since there were surviving Canaanites, that some Canaanites were still doing. You need to have nothing to do with that, and that gets portrayed figuratively as wipe it all out. But that language was not meant to be literally applied by the Israelites, because when these documents were written, there was not an extermination of Canaanites underway. This was after those conflicts had resolved. And so consequently, if we say, what is the biblical author trying to teach his audience? It's the radical incompatibility of paganism with the worship of the true God. He's not trying to teach them literally go kill everybody in these Canaanite villages. That's a historical situation that's already passed. So that's the position that I tend to favor. I wouldn't call it allegorizing. I would say because I'm not trying to read an allegory. I'm just trying to say, what's the biblical author trying to communicate in a non-literal way via the language he uses in the text.
Randall, let's get your thoughts now.
My camera, I think, has gotten a little blurry. My apologies for that. My
It's
camera
okay, you're about
is
to leave.
yeah, and it is errant. My camera's errant. So, okay. So, first of all, I think the one thing I would want to emphasize is that within many contexts, there are Christians who think, and many evangelical apologists in particular, who approach these texts as if the only way to think about them ultimately is to believe that God eradicated these entire civilian populations, and that if you don't believe that, you're somehow being unfaithful to Scripture. And what I think that does is that sets up a terrible crisis of faith for people. And some people, if they cannot resolve that, their decision is, well, either I have to believe that sometimes it's morally warranted to massacre babies, or I can't follow Jesus. And so the first thing I want to just emphasize is that that's a false dichotomy. And there are many options, including what Jimmy just described here. And I don't think anybody should sacrifice their most fundamental moral intuitions. I mean, at points, our moral intuitions are going to run up against the gospel, perhaps, and be challenged, and we may have to revise them. But there's something else about revising or rejecting some of your most fundamental moral convictions and thinking that that's a requirement for following Jesus. It just isn't. And along those lines as well, in terms of what is Christianity, I always like to begin with the Apostles' Creed. The Apostles' Creed summarizes the core commitments of Christian doctrinal conviction. So you have things like Trinity, incarnation, fall, atonement, restoration, and so on. What is not in there is a particular reading of Joshua, right, or of Deuteronomy. And so there can be freedom for the Christians to explore these different issues. Now, the view that Jimmy's described and that he's most, sounds like leaning toward, the spirit, I would call it spiritualizing of it, which would include allegory, but as he said, there are other ways to approach it which are not allegorization. Some of the scholars that I've read that have endorsed this kind of view, Jerome Creech is another contemporary scholar, I think, has a similar view, except he would put it as occurring at the time of the Josianic reforms and afterwards, that as the people of Israel are facing down Babylon and going to go into exile in Babylon, these texts are brought together for their community, to center their community, to remain and remind themselves always to be distinct from the culture of Babylon and maintain their own distinctive identity, so that these texts were being read within a context that was maybe 700 years after the events they purportedly narrate. And so they would have been interpreted within that context, not as providing a warrant for the Israelites to go out and kill people in large numbers, but rather for them to maintain their fidelity even when they are in exile. Now, one clarification when it comes to a providential errantist view is it's not rejecting inerrancy, it's clarifying the concept of inerrancy with respect to divine authorial intent. So insofar as there are errors in the human perspectives of the authors in terms of what they say about history or science or morality or prudential observations or theology, that is because God has providentially allowed those limited human perspectives as part of progressive revelation to be within the text. And that's consistent with the text being inerrant with respect to God's overall divine purposes. So you could have a very robust account of biblical inerrancy with respect to divine authorial intent, and yet recognize there's limited human fallible perspectives that we can critique within the text in light, for example, of what we believe it means to follow Jesus in this world. So those are some quick thoughts. Again, I just would really want to hammer on this point that, and I really admire Jimmy Steele Manning, Craig's point, but I also think that we need the tension there, which I face is, I frankly don't want this to be a live debate. I want to get beyond, I hope Christianity gets beyond the point where there are people who need to steel man this, because I don't think it's helpful for the witness of Christ. This is no slight on anybody here. I think we have to critically engage with the most robust views of our interlocutors. But I want to get to the point where Christianity, this is not a live option on the table. I mean, 150, 200 years ago, there were Christians widely arguing for pro-slavery interpretations of the Bible. And those are no longer live conversations within Christianity. And I hope that we get to the point in the future where defending the ethics of the mass eradication of civilian populations is no longer one of the live options that we are countenancing within Christianity.
Yeah, one of the things that we didn't really do very explicitly is talk about hermeneutical principles in interpreting these texts and what sort of considerations would be relevant when trying to determine which interpretation to favor over the others. We've kind of like mentioned different things that would be relevant, but I think moral intuitions are relevant in choosing or deciding which interpretation of Scripture is the best one. And maybe that's a conversation for another time, is just basic hermeneutical principles. But
can I give a 30-second on that, and then I'll bow out? Yeah,
sure.
So borrowed from Augustine, or adapted from Augustine, the principle that, and I originally, Eric Siebert, reading his work, really introduced me to this principle, and I've expanded my understanding of it since, is always read Scripture so as to increase the love of God and neighbor. That's what the core, in my mind, of Scripture is about. It's about making us to be disciples or followers of Jesus who love God and neighbor rightly. And neighbor, in, I think, the life and teaching of Jesus, is everybody, including people from the outgroups that you are most likely and inclined to dislike, to want to dehumanize and objectify. So if you're reading Scripture in a way that leads you to further dehumanize and objectify particular groups of human beings, you're not reading it rightly. That may not tell you how to read it, but it does give you a direction in which we need to keep working on our reading, interpretation, and application of the text.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general it's good to take a sort of Christocentric view of the Bible, and I think that's also going to, it should at least guide the way that we interpret passages. And obviously, like, Catholics and Protestants are going to disagree. There's going to be differences in like all of the data that's sort of relevant when trying to figure out or parse out which interpretation is the correct interpretation. It depends on what passages we're talking about, but yeah, I think it does open an interesting question about, I mean, this whole thing obviously opens that whole question wide open. So, but yeah, I think it's a really important topic. But Randall, thanks for joining. I really appreciate you coming back on the channel, taking some time, and I'm actually kind of excited to see you back on Twitter. I know that you took a sort of a hiatus. I think I remember you saying that you were like leaving for good, but you're back, so it is good to see you again.
I'm sad to say that there aren't other better options out there, so I'm back. But
yeah,
such as it is. Hey, it's been great.
You could always go to Truth Social.
Yeah, well, we'll leave that for another day. All right, thanks a lot, guys. Take care.
Okay, all right, see you later. All right, so I've got Jimmy here, and I wanted to actually say that this is kind of exciting because this was not planned to go longer than what we had Randall for, but this is kind of like the extended version of this show. And so what we're going to do is we're going to play some more clips, get some more commentary on this subject. So what it's going to allow us to do is talk about that clip at the beginning that I mentioned, where we talk about science and philosophy. Then we're going to talk about Alex's argument regarding abortion, the women who killed children. Alex, he pushes back on Joshua 8, Richard Dawkins and his rationality and his argument to not debate Dr. Craig. So we're going to be able to get to a lot more interesting stuff and interesting clips from this show. So I'm actually really excited to spend a little bit more time with Jimmy here.
Too.
So
no problem. I did 6.5 hours on Pints with Aquinas a couple weeks ago. I can go longer here.
I don't think we're going to be able to do all that today, but we'll see where we can get. Another thing that I'm excited about is that I actually you gave me the exact timestamps for the rest of these clips, so I don't have to worry about that. But let's start back. Let's continue where we are, and then we'll kind of track all the way back at the end. Once we kind of reach the last of the clips on this topic, we'll circle back to the beginning clip on science and philosophy, which I'm excited to talk about. That was one of the more interesting parts of the conversation, and it was only a couple minutes long. But let's get to the next clip, and this one again is about abortion. So this one's 39:38. Let me go ahead and pull up the scene here. 39:38. Oh, I think I already got it pulled up here. So we'll go ahead and play it here.
The first is to say that there are areas like take the issue of abortion, for example. Now, you might think that it's immoral to have an abortion because God has commanded that you shouldn't take innocent life, in the absence of some specific divine command, sure. But a lot of the time in this discussion, people do talk in language which points to how this is bad for the child. You're taking away the life of a child. You're committing some wrong towards the child. This position that you're advocating here would seem to remove the ability to do that. You can still say that abortion is wrong if you like, but you can't say that it in any way harms the child. In fact, it seems like you're committed to the view that it confers a great good upon the child when a parent has an abortion.
Absolutely. I mean, what?
Yeah, so I think that that Craig is, I think he's mishandling this, because I think Alex has a really good point that when people talk about abortion, they talk about it in terms of doing harm to the child. And Craig doesn't seem to fully acknowledge that. What he does do in a little bit, and you don't have to play this because I'll just summarize it, but he says the harm you are doing to the child is denying the child the finite goods that the child would otherwise experience in life if, let's say, in the ancient world, they lived for 50 years or something. They'd have the chance to experience a lot of finite earthly goods in that time, and by aborting the child, you are robbing them of that. And that's true. That's correct. But I think it's incomplete. And I think that, again, part of my difficulty with Craig's approach is he seems to think that God's commands don't flow from his nature or don't flow from other considerations the way I think they do. I don't think God's going to command just anything. I don't think its divine commands are just fiats that God comes up with without a basis. So one of the, in addition to the finite earthly enjoyments that a child would have on earth if you allow the child to grow up, from a Christian perspective, there are other things that we do in this life that have ramifications after this life. You mentioned earlier the soul building theodicies, where it says, okay, well, by facing adversity and triumphing, you build various virtues, and those virtues you build in this life are going to have a payoff in the next life. And so in addition to enjoyments that the child would be denied by aborting him, you're also denying the child the opportunity of soul building. And that has eternal ramifications. And since they're eternal, they're actually infinite. Furthermore, even besides soul building, traditional Christian theology has recognized that there are certain things that humans can only do in a wayfaring state, or as a viator, meaning they're alive. The most obvious one is turning to Jesus and embracing salvation. That's something we can do in this life. It's not something we do in the next. But beyond that, one of the things that's made very clear at numerous passages in the Bible, and especially in St. Paul, is that in this life, we do actions in cooperation with God's grace that God will reward. Paul says that in Romans 2, that for those who seek glory and honor and immortality by perseverance and working good, God will give them those things. And he says essentially the same thing in Galatians 6. So if you kill a child when they're in the womb or as an infant, then you are denying the child the ability to earn rewards in heaven, or to commit or to do actions that God will reward. So you're cutting off rewards that child would otherwise be able to enjoy for all eternity. So I think from a Christian point of view, Craig is underselling the harm that is done by things like abortion and infanticide, because it's denying the child the opportunity of soul building, and it's denying the child the opportunity of obtaining rewards. And both of those have eternal consequences. It's not simply a finite loss of pleasures from this life.
That does actually remind me of one of the arguments that is used in defense of the pro-life position. It's called, I can't remember the philosopher's name who sort of created it or came up with the argument. It's a future like ours. I can't remember. Marquis, I think. Do you know who I'm talking about?
I'm not off the top of my head.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I had the wrong super chat up here. But anyways, we did actually receive a super chat, so let me get to that now. That's why I've got the scene up here from Tifer Forshin. Again, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but forgive me if I'm not. He says, he or she, morality is objective but context dependent. Past actions once moral may now be immoral due to increased intellectual and physical resources. My initial response when reading this is it's still got to be consistent with God's loving nature, regardless of when it was commanded. Right. And so you might say that there is now an increase in intellectual and physical resources now that sort of changed the situation. So context is definitely important, but nevertheless, we still need to look at the actual context and figure out exactly what was going on back then that would have allowed God to command that. And when I say allow, I mean in the sense of like interpreting that in the sense of making it consistent with a being that is perfectly loving. Mm-hmm. So yeah, any thoughts on this super chat?
Yeah, past actions that were once moral may now be immoral due to increased intellectual and physical resources. That's true. I can imagine examples. To give one illustration, suppose somebody has malaria and they're suffering incredibly and they may die. Okay, well, let's say it's 1850. It's 174 years ago, and we don't have a lot of great malarial treatments. Let's say the best one we have is drug X, and drug X will hopefully cure their malaria, but it's going to hurt like heck, and it has a lot of side effects that are bad. Well, in that circumstance, in order to cure the person's life-threatening malaria, I can give them drug X because it's the best thing I got to treat it. But now that we're in 2024, we've got drug Y, and drug Y will cure their malaria without any of the side effects and any of the pain and suffering that drug X would put them through. Now it would no longer be legitimate to give them drug X because we have drug Y, which is much better. And so I can see how giving drug X was moral because of the limitations of the time, but it's not moral now because we have different intellectual and physical resources. So I acknowledge that as a true principle, but I also acknowledge what you said, Cam, which is underlying that there is a fundamental principle of what's the most loving thing to do for this person in this situation. And that has shifted with time. So I guess that's what my reaction would be.
Yeah, it's ultimately going to come back to that question of whether or not that command was a loving thing to command. Mm-hmm. So, all right, let's move on to the next clip. This one is, let me go ahead and pull up my scene here. This one is about the woman. What was her name again?
Oh,
that
actually killed. Yeah. So he mentions two women. Oh, he mentions one woman. The woman that Craig mentions is Andrea Yates, but he seems who killed her children in 2001. But I think he's misremembering the woman that Alex refers to killed her children in 2004 and said that God told her to do it. And that woman's name is Deanna Laney.
Yeah, no, I think this was actually a good point to bring up from Alex here, and it's one of the more challenging pushbacks that he provides against Dr. Craig's view. But let's go ahead and play it, and then get some comments.
But look, one of the things that Randal Rauser talks about as well is this example of someone who in 2004 committed infanticide, killed her own child.
Yes.
And says that she did so because she believed God was commanding her to. Now, it will be easy enough to just say, I just don't think God was commanding her to. But the question I want to ask is, given everything you've just said, how can we know this? Because generally, if I ask somebody, look, if God told you to shoot up a primary school, would you do it? And what they tend to say is something like, well, I wouldn't believe that was God because that runs against his nature. The problem is that sure, you might want to say that, just asking a mother to kill her child for no apparent reason might run against God's nature. It just seems to me that intuitively, if we didn't have this story in the Hebrew Bible, if the story of the Canaanites didn't exist, and we were speaking in the hypothetical, and I said, well, what if God told you to, I don't know, walk into somebody's land and not just drive them out, but if they refuse to go, to kill them, and then come back and kill the women and kill the children, and in fact kill the animals too, and if they leave the animals, they get punished for not killing the animals as well. What if he told you to do something like that? And I imagine the only thing somebody would be able to say is that, well, of course God wouldn't tell me to do that, and that's how I know that I wouldn't want to follow that command. But that's exactly what's happening here. So it leads us to a radical moral skepticism, in other words, is Rauser's critique.
Oh, I don't think it does that. But notice what you're raising here now is an epistemological question, not a metaethical question. This is now no longer a question about whether or not it would be right or even obligatory to carry out such a command. The question now you're raising is an epistemic question about how could I be sure that God has in fact issued such a command. And in the case that you mentioned of Andrea Yates, this was a severely mentally disturbed woman who was hearing voices and was schizophrenic. And it might well be the case that epistemically, Alex, that no one would be justified today in thinking that God had issued such a command. It would be plausible to think that they ought to conclude that in fact they're hallucinatory or schizophrenic or mentally ill and go see a counselor. But that's an epistemic question about how did God communicate his revelation to Joshua and these Old Testament Israelites in such a self-authenticating way that there was no doubt that this was being commanded to them.
So I think Craig is correct that Alex has asked an epistemic question, but I think that it is also playing a tactical function in the discussion of the morality of this, because what one could do from Alex's position is say, look, I'm very hesitant about your proposal that God could tell people to do this and that would make it all right. So if I'm going to entertain that proposal, then I need to see, well, how am I going to distinguish between a circumstance where God is really telling me it's all right or even obligatory to kill these people versus another situation where someone thinks that God is telling them, like in the case of Deanna Laney, but really is not. I mean, how do I distinguish between those? And if you can't give me a good way of distinguishing between them, if you can't give me an answer to that question epistemically, then I shouldn't even be entertaining your hypothesis morally, because it's going to lead to morally absurd results. So the way, and I think that—
Or entertain his interpretation of that passage.
Yeah.
Which I think does get back to the sort of thing that we talked about right as Randall was leading, is what sort of resources are open to you when you're interpreting some passage of Scripture. And I think, I mean, Alex is kind of highlighting, and he didn't put it in these terms, but I think he is highlighting something that's relevant here, that our moral intuitions are sort of pinging when we consider these accounts of these people who thought that they were hearing from God and committed infanticide or whatever, or killed their children. And that's horrible. And no one would ever think, oh yeah, God actually was telling them that. But then you want to go to the Old Testament and see and say, oh, well, God was definitely telling them that, and that seems to be where the sort of conflict that Alex is highlighting here. And so Dr. Craig could say, well, I'm more interested in like the metaethical question. But even if it's like you say, or like Dr. Craig said, an epistemic question, I think some of those same concerns can still be used in evaluating which interpretation is correct. Even if it is epistemic in nature, those sorts of considerations can still play a part when we're trying or attempting to decide which interpretation of this passage is the correct one.
Right. I would agree. And my moral intuitions, among other things, including the history of the text, leads me towards the view that I've articulated. But if I'm going to try to be Craig for a moment, and answer Alex's question directly, I would say, well, okay, on one level, the reason I personally, Bill Craig, believe this is because I believe Moses and was an inspired prophet, and Joshua is an inspired book of scripture. I don't believe Deanna Laney or Andrea Yates was in the same situation. And so I would distinguish, I've got inspired scripture versus personal subjective opinion of people who are exhibiting signs of mental illness. And that's a relevant thing for me, Bill Craig, to do. But if you're asking me, what if I'm in the situation? Let's say I'm one of Joshua's followers. What tells me that Joshua is right with this prophetic word he's received from the Lord? And how would I react as a person today in a similar situation? Well, I'd say a couple of things. First one is, if I'm one of Joshua's followers, I think like an ancient Near Easterner. I don't think like a 21st century lily-livered, person. Because frankly, people today, when it comes to the use of violence, we're all wimps, except for the sociopaths among us. Mm-hmm.
What is? Sorry, I've got something itching my nose here.
Oh, sure.
You use the term lily-livered. What is that? I've never heard that before.
Oh, lily-livered is another. It's a term that is used. It means cowardly or squeamish or unable to face hard realities. And is it referencing like a lily, like a because flower? Lilies are light colored, and it was believed under I guess heroic medicine that if your liver had been drained of color, it's like you don't got a lot of blood flow there and stuff, the humors aren't in it the way they should be, then you would be cowardly and weak and unable to face hard realities. So it was believed your liver would be a different color. At least that's the basis of the metaphor.
Okay. I've never heard that one before, but that was interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry to kind of get off track here.
Linguistics is fun. But if I'm an ancient Near Easterner, I'm going to be much less squeamish than modern people are. So my moral intuitions about the use of violence against my enemies is going to be very different. And I'm going to have a powerful conviction because we just came out of Egypt. We just saw Moses and all his signs and wonders. Moses left us instructions about going into the land. They included things about use of lethal violence against entire cities of Canaanites. And so I'm already been convinced by Moses. And when Joshua gets a revelation saying, okay, do what Moses said to do, I'm going to find that very persuasive. So I think there would be a rational epistemic basis for a person in that circumstance to say, okay, this is what we need to do. However, I'm in a very different circumstance today. I'm a 21st century wimp when it comes to the use of violence, even against enemies. I've been inculcated.
You're a lily-liver.
I'm lily-livered. I've also been inculcated culturally with Jesus's love even your enemies ethic and turn the other cheek and things like that. And so I'm going to view such commands much more skeptically, especially if they're not coming from an authenticated prophet in the situation that a follower of Joshua was in, because they were just executing what Moses had done. Moses was a big, impressive prophet. A woman today thinks God is telling her to kill her children. Okay, what kind of prophetic track record does she have? I'm not seeing a good one in the case of these women. So I think there would be a rational basis for a person in Joshua's situation to say, okay, this is what we need to do. This is what God wants. And I think there would be a rational basis for a person today to reject that, saying, we're just not in that same situation. We don't have a Moses now. We don't have an authenticated prophet the way that Moses was, or that whoever was advising Joshua was a prophet. And also there's been an enormous shift in how God works with his people. We've had Jesus come and teach us this love your enemies ethic. Is it really plausible that today God is going to be giving this order compared to what God was likely to give back at the time of the conquest? And so I think there are a bunch of reasons why one would look at a similar killing command today and say, no, that doesn't make any sense today. Whereas it might have made sense for the followers of Joshua.
I want to bring up a distinction that I think I made earlier on in the show. I can't remember if I made. I think I did, but the distinction is between God allowing something to happen and then God commanding it to happen. And I think one of the problem of evil is already like, a really strong argument to a lot of atheists is they say the problem of evil, God can't allow this stuff. It seems incompatible with God's loving nature. Some of them will say it's like legitimately evil. Other atheists who don't want to affirm objective morality will just say, we'll use this as a sort of internal critique. It's inconsistent with God's loving nature, right? And this is, again, sort of an extension of that. And that's one of the reasons why Dr. Craig said that there's a lot of similarities between this and the problem of evil. But I think that this takes it a step further because it's not just a fact of, especially if you take the literalist interpretation, it's not just a fact of like, did God allow these children to die in some horrible way? It's God commanded these Israelites to go over there and do this. And I think that's really the intuition that is really striking people as, and even a lot of Christians, that's, I think, why they're opting for these other alternative interpretations. It's because that just seems incompatible with God's love. You might have some theodicy, some reason why God would allow bad things to happen, why God would allow it to happen, but you can't necessarily transfer those reasons to a situation where God is commanding some bad thing to happen, right? So I think that's again, kind of going back to Alex's point here, I think he is highlighting something that is relevant when we're trying to figure out which interpretation of these passages to favor, or at least what view to favor, right? You could even be a divine command theorist like Dr. Craig is, but then still prefer a different interpretation, an allegorical or spiritual interpretation of these passages. But yeah, feel free to share any thoughts on that, and then we'll move to the next clip.
Yeah, one of the things that historically Christian theologians have been very comfortable with is the idea of God actively commanding physical evil. Now, God cannot command moral evil because that would implicate God in sin. But with a physical evil, Christian theologians for all the way down through history have been very comfortable saying, yeah, God commands physical evils because they're only physical. They're not moral. They're not wrong in and of themselves. So God could, for example, command somebody's death, either whether due to human causation or a disease or whatever it may be. Modern theologians in the last 150 years have become less comfortable with that. At least many of them have. And I understand that. I tend to want to think in terms of not of God commanding physical evils, but God allowing physical evils. And so, like, if someone today dies, I'm less inclined to say, oh, God determined it was this person's time, and so he caused this person to die. I would be more inclined to say God allowed this person to die. And that does have an impact because the ancient Israelites are definitely thinking in terms of God actively commanding things. But it's not always clear that those statements should be taken literally. For example, in one, and there are other ways of taking this text, but in one passage, it says that God caused David to take a census, but it was wrong for David to do so. So that even looks like God's endorsing moral evil. He's making David sin. But in another passage that parallels this and describes the same incident, it says, say either Satan or an enemy prompted David to take the census, and then God punished him for it. And that second passage is more open to, well, maybe God just allowed something to prompt David to take the census. He didn't actively command it. And so I think that because the Israelites tended to have this very active, muscular, God did this and commanded that language, when we read biblical passages, we have to be sensitive to the question of, well, how much of this is literal versus how much of it is God just allowed this to happen? And that's a complicating factor when we read biblical texts, especially in the Old Testament, because the Israelites wanted to make God sound like this macho, powerful, in-charge king who rules everything in his kingdom with literally a rod of iron and or figuratively a rod of iron. And so they wanted to use this language to build up God as a way of stressing his power. But today there are these philosophical questions and moral intuitions about maybe God's not so much causing people to die as allowing people to die, and it complicates our reading of these texts, or at least adds a new question that needs to be asked when we approach them.
At the risk of sort of reiterating what I just said, I think I have a better way of articulating what the thought here is. So Alex, the way that he phrases his objection to Dr. Craig here, and we're still talking about the woman who committed infanticide against her children on the basis of hearing that God told her to do this. And so if you're just joining us, that's what we're currently talking about. But Alex kind of posed it epistemologically, and Dr. Craig, I think, was right to point out that, like, hey, that's an epistemological question, but what I'm talking about is metaethics or interpretation or whatever else, or history. And but what I think could be done in this situation is just alter or change Alex's objection just slightly and be like, no, actually, I'm not asking an epistemological question anymore. I'm actually making a point that is relevant to natural theology, which is that God can't command this certain type of action. And that is, I think, what is sort of behind the intuition that we have when we consider these accounts of these crazy people who have committed infanticide. The intuition behind that is God could never command something like that, or God couldn't even allow something like that to happen, someone to think that, or command that thing happened. And so then you just apply that consistently from that situation then to these Old Testament narratives and be like, so it's not a situation where you're addressing this alternate, it's not a question of like this epistemological question versus metaethics. You're instead highlighting this common theme that exists between these contemporary stories and this Old Testament narrative, and saying this same reason is being applied in both situations, and that's why we should have adopted this other interpretation. Maybe that's a stronger way of, I think, putting Alex's objection and then just kind of reiterating what I was saying earlier. Feel free to share any thoughts, otherwise we can move on.
Well, I'm not sure that Alex is arguing for a different interpretation of the text. I think he would be fine with just the text is wrong. But if I'm Craig, what I would say to that is, okay, let me see if I can remember enough of what you said to be able to respond. If I'm Craig, I would have to say, well, look, there are situations in which God can call for the death of someone because it's not contrary to fundamental law. And I would appeal, and Craig might also appeal to a distinction that Aquinas makes between fundamental moral principles and secondary moral principles. Fundamental moral principles are going to include, do good and avoid evil, for example. And from that, under most circumstances, we can draw the secondary conclusion, therefore do not kill innocent people. But that secondary conclusion can be suspended without violating first order principles in particular circumstances. And God has determined that in the circumstances of the Canaanites, though that second order conclusion was suspended, there were sufficient reasons for God to order the destruction of the Canaanites. However, God has not made that determination today with respect to people like this. So I think that Craig could try to mount a defense to a challenge like this by biting the bullet and saying, yeah, God can sometimes command the death of innocent people. And then I would tend to phrase it in terms of all life is a gift. God determines how much of that gift a person gets, and God can determine the means or the circumstances in which the person's life ends. So yeah, in some circumstances, he could command the death of an innocent person. He could command the killing of an innocent person. But we have evidence that he did that in the case of Joshua. We don't have evidence that he did that in the case of Deanna Laney. At least that's how I would try to approach it if I was Craig.
All right, let's move on to the next clip, and this one involves Joshua 8. Why don't you actually go ahead and set this one up for us as I pull it up on the screen here?
So at one point, they actually engage a scriptural text. Alex brings up Joshua 8, which is part of the conquest narrative. It's after the Israelites have conquered Jericho, with the famous walls falling down, and they've moved on to the next town, or the next major city, or the next encampment that they're dealing with, which is a city called Ai. And what Craig has been doing up to now is arguing that really, all that had to happen was to get the Canaanites out of the land. So if they would flee, then they wouldn't have to be killed. And Alex brings up Joshua 8 because he sees it as a passage where the Israelites are actually chasing down the people who have fled. But Alex is misreading the text, as we'll see after I explain the context of it once we hear what they actually say.
Here we go.
Commandment is clear. Now, where it says to chase them out, we have in Joshua chapter 8, when Israel had finished killing all the men of Ai in the fields and in the wilderness where they had chased them, and when every one of them had been put to the sword, all of the Israelites returned to Ai and killed those who were in it. 12,000 men and women fell that day, all the people of Ai. So it seems here that, yes, they were chased out, but the Israelites then chased after them once they had been removed from the city, killed them out in the wilderness, turned around, came back, killed everyone else who was left in the city. And who would that have been? It would have been the women, the children, the disabled, etc. So it seems to me that even if we have, God saying that you just need to chase them out, and even if, they don't end up in practice all being killed, it still seems like this could be described as at least an attempted genocide against the Canaanites.
Well, so at this point, unfortunately, Craig is not familiar enough with this text to interact with it. And he kind of struggles a little bit and says, well, this sounds like just the aftermath of a battle to me. And he does an okay job, addressing it in that way, but they're both actually making a mistake here. If you read Joshua 8, the key phrase is to the fields where they had chased them. And so how Alex is interpreting that is the Israelites have chased the men of Ai into these fields. So the idea that Alex is proposing is that on Craig's thesis, they can't just leave because they were trying to leave, and the Israelites chased them down anyway and killed them. Okay, that is not actually what's happening in Joshua 8, and the ambiguity is in the phrase where they chased them. Who is the they and the them? If you back up and read the whole chapter in Joshua 8, this is a stratagem. God is telling the Israelites, here's how I want you to take Ai. I'm going to give their king into your hand. I'm going to give the whole city into your hand. Here's how you do it. You use a feint. So you divide the Israelite army. You put some of the Israelite army behind Ai to the west of Ai. And then Joshua, you lead your force in from the other direction to the east of Ai. And what will happen is the fighting men of Ai will come out to fight against you. Then you flee and they will chase you. And then you can have your other force sneak up on Ai, set it on fire. The men of Ai will look back and see their city is on fire, and it will cause confusion in their army. And you can conquer the men, and you can also go in and conquer the city. And by the way, destroy everybody who's there. So that's what's really going on. It's not that the men of Ai are trying to flee the Israelites. They're trying to catch the Israelites. And so Alex is misreading the text, and Craig doesn't realize that he's misreading the text. This is not a case of people of Canaanites are trying to leave and the Israelites are not letting them. It's actually the Canaanites are trying to attack the Israelites, but the Israelites have put them in this surprising strategic situation. But here's the thing. The text still works for Alex's position because they don't give the people of AI the chance to leave the promised land. They assume they are just going to stay in the promised land, and they set up this stratagem to trap them. And so what this passage shows is an example of the Israelites exterminating this entire town without giving them the option to flee. And I think this is one of the reasons that Craig's, they could just leave proposal, while it's technically true, if they left the promised land, they wouldn't be chased. But I think that that's not really what's going on in the text. They're not really giving the Canaanites the opportunity to leave. They're just assuming they're going to stay and attacking them and trapping them strategically.
Yeah, we've already talked about all the other aspects of this. So let's move on to 3 other clips. And these 3 are not necessarily strictly related to the topic that we've been discussing this entire time. So I'm actually going to save. Yeah, they're like you said, they're interlinked. They're definitely related. But the first one, science and philosophy, I'm going to save that one for last because it was, like I said, probably my favorite.
Yeah, that's a separate subject.
Super interesting first part of their discussion. But yeah, let's talk about the last 2. Yeah, the Dawkins one, and whether or not this is a good reason for him not to debate Dr. Craig. I think that would be good to turn to next here. So let's go ahead and do that. And that one happens about 101:12. Let me see if I can find that quickly. There we go. All right, here we go.
In that case, do you think that Richard Dawkins, to wrap this up, to come full circle, is being completely irrational or understandably wrong, or maybe there's some truth in it if his worldview is correct?
Yeah.
Where do you land in terms of what he's doing when he makes this response, hearing everything you say, and say, I just don't want anything to do with you? What do you think?
Okay, I mean,
boy,
there's a lot of levels on which we can answer this. I think that my position on the Canaanite conquest was God's gift to Richard Dawkins, because it enabled him to find an excuse for not debating me that gave him the moral high ground. Whereas his other previous excuses, like that I'm a creationist, or he's busy, or it would look good on my resume but not on his, all of those many, many excuses fall flat. But this one, you see, gave him the moral high ground for refusing to engage, and therefore was very convenient for him. Having said that, I think it's entirely under.
So I totally agree with Craig here. If you watch the full
I like the way
video,
he phrased it too. God's gift to Richard Dawkins.
God's gift to Richard Dawkins. Yeah, God loves even Richard Dawkins. He'll give you gifts. So if you watch the full Within Reason video, what Alex is doing is he's invited Bill Craig on to respond to Richard Dawkins's claim that he won't debate Bill Craig because Bill Craig is an apologist for genocide and so forth, and he just won't have anything to do with someone that morally filthy. And as someone who does debates, as soon as I heard that at the beginning, before they even got into the Canaanite stuff, I said, that's BS. That's an excuse. That is not a real reason. If you don't want to debate someone, just say, I don't want to debate him. I don't feel inclined to debate this person. But if you go beyond that and try to make up excuses like, oh, that person is so morally filthy, I won't have anything to do with them. It rings hollow. I mean, maybe if the person was a child molester and you say, I'm sorry, I don't debate child molesters, but just because they have a different opinion than I do about biblical texts, that's not a legitimate reason. So I immediately spotted that as that's just an excuse. There's whatever the real reason is that Dawkins doesn't want to debate Craig. It's not that. And I've got another illustration of why that's the case with the second of the 2 clips. So why don't we turn to that one?
Okay. And that one is biblical inerrancy?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, actually, no. Let me make my other point about that. So one of the things that I kept wondering, because a lot of this debate centered on Alex talking to Bill Craig about children and infants and how wrong it is to kill them. And I found myself thinking, well, wait a minute. I mean, these guys are sounding awfully pro-life. Are they really? Is for example, Dawkins really so pro-life that he wouldn't debate a pro-abortion person or a pro-infanticide person like the philosopher Peter Singer? Would he not talk to such people? It seemed to me that actually you have a wide swath of agreement in secular circles with the idea that abortion is morally legitimate, and that even infanticide can be morally legitimate based on arguments that young children are not yet persons. And so if those are the circles in which these views about abortion and infanticide are common, then how much real moral outrage is there here? Should these people really be as outraged as they are about the treatment of Canaanite children as they're sounding like, or is this just a matter of convenience to them, where when it's convenient to be opposed to infanticide, as in the case of the Canaanite children, they get on their moral high horses against Christians. But when it comes down to, well, what do you really think about infanticide? Are children really persons that have a right to life that you can't violate? A lot of them are actually, well, technically, no, they don't. So it seems to me that a lot of this is really convenience and excuse making rather than principled moral objection to the things we're talking about.
Yeah, I wonder if there'd be a way to steelman that and say something similar to the age of accountability. Like there is nevertheless an age at which these children, at least on their view, become persons. And so even then, like, consistent with their own view, like say let's suppose that the age is like 3. Again, this is a really dumb view in my opinion. But let's just say that like the cutoff is like 3 years old. After 3 years old, these children become persons and they become valuable. They could nevertheless take issue with the children that were killed between, say, 3 and 11 or 3 and 15 or whatever that age group is. They could still express moral repugnance about the killing of that age group, right? So maybe
they could express moral repugnance about the killing of the adult Canaanites. But that's not what they're doing when they're focusing on the kids. And it seems like when they focus on the kids, the young children, that they're generating outrage about something they're not outraged about in other contexts. So it seems to me that they're using tactics of convenience rather than principle there.
Yeah, I mean, that does kind of bring to mind something I've been thinking a while, which is that the how do I want to describe them? The left, I suppose. The left. They seem to really care about those that are oppressed, and there's all sorts of groups that they consider are oppressed, and I think that's legitimate in a lot of ways. Like there are obviously oppressed groups,
sure,
but it seems to me like one of the most oppressed groups would be these small children, and so it's almost like it's a weird. And I know that they would say the same thing about Republicans or people on the right, that there's inconsistencies in their own views, but it seems to me like this is one of the most glaring inconsistencies on their part, is that they claim to be very huge advocates for the oppressed. Yet when it comes to the unborn, like those people can just be oppressed all we want. We can oppress them as often as possible. So it just seems to me like that.
Per what Randall was saying earlier, you dehumanize the people you want to kill. So they'll say, well, it's not a full human. Yeah, not a full human, or what I've heard most of the time is that they're not persons. I've even heard Christians say that they're not ensouled yet, right? The age of ensoulment happens at some point, and it's not the point at which abortions are okay.
But it's just a sort of side comment that it seems to me like if you're really concerned about the oppressed, you should also be, well, you should be concerned across the board about the oppressed. And it seems to me like the unborn are really oppressed right now. We're making progress, I think, toward alleviating that. It's not enough progress, but anyways, that's what sort of came to mind there.
Yeah.
Was there another clip that you wanted to discuss?
I think the 105 clip will also address. It'll make two good points. One of which deals with why Dawkins doesn't want to debate.
Okay, let me go ahead and pull that one up here.
Well, I've told you how I feel about it, and I know that we're out of time. It's a shame that we won't get to see you and Dr. Dawkins, at least it seems, have this conversation directly. But Dr. Craig, I really do appreciate you coming back on the show, especially to defend what is, on the surface, a difficult and, as far as people like Dawkins would see it, indefensible position. So it means all the more that you would be willing to come on a show like this and defend
Certainly.
that position.
Now, can we add one thing here at the end that we didn't get to?
Of course.
One of the commendable and, for me, surprising things about Professor Dawkins is that he understood what the implication or the importance of this objection is. This is not an objection to the existence of God. This is not an objection to the moral argument for God's existence. What is it an objection to? It's an objection to biblical inerrancy. And therefore, Dawkins will say, sophisticated theologians will say that this story in the Old Testament is simply false, that it's
See, I don't think that's true. It's not an objection to biblical inerrancy. It's an objection at most to a particular interpretation of the passage. Was that the point that you were going to make? I'm not sure.
Well, there's just a little bit more to it.
either legendary or else Israel, carried away by its nationalistic fervor, thought that God had given them a divine command when they really hadn't. So that what this calls into question is not any of the core doctrines of the Judeo-Christian worldview, but simply a view of biblical inerrancy. And I gathered from Dawkins' comments to you that he doesn't seem to think that that's really a very serious objection. I think that he's probably familiar with a lot of British Christians who are not committed to a doctrine of biblical inerrancy, and therefore don't feel that this affects the core tenets of a Judeo-Christian worldview. And I think that's quite right.
So I agree. And they actually played a clip. Alex played a clip at the beginning of this of him talking to Richard Dawkins, where Dawkins does dismiss Craig by saying, oh, he's not like a real theologian who would say this story just never happened. And so I think that Craig is correct that Dawkins is recognizing that that not all Christians would hold that you've got to believe this. Dawkins recognizes not all Christians are going to take Craig's view, and he does presumably think better of Craig, or think better of people who disagree with Craig than he thinks of Craig. So I think Craig has something here, that this is really a question about either biblical literalism or biblical inerrancy or something like that. It's not about the core doctrines of Christianity. And I think it is important for people to realize that. And I also think that it's another illustration of a problem for Dawkins's claim that the reason he won't debate Craig is because Craig is so evil. If we're just talking about a question like, is this passage meant to be taken literally or accurate, or is it accurate?
Yeah, but another thing that has sort of bothered me about this situation is that a lot of people express this sort of moral outrage, as Dawkins does, to Dr. Craig's view, but then they're just incapable of expressing like an actual philosophical objection to his view. Mm-hmm. And you can hear that like when Dawkins was on with Alex O'Connor, and I've heard him in the past, he really only just mentions this issue and then kind of sidesteps and doesn't really even talk about or interact with Dr. Craig's position on this. Mm-hmm. He doesn't provide some sort of philosophical analysis or theological analysis of his interpretation of these passages. He just kind of like, asserts that it's just immoral. And that's sort of bothered me too. I mean, I don't agree with Dr. Craig on this. maybe a shock to my audience that I don't agree with everything that Dr. Craig says, but
shows independent
bothered
thinking.
me. Yeah, well, it's bothered me that that people kind of dismiss it and they just express this sort of moral repugnance about it and then fail to actually deeply interact with his view, which I think is a lot more nuanced than people give credit for. And you've got to really get down into the weeds with him and figure out, give an actual objection to his view. And I'm failing to see that from Richard Dawkins.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, I don't agree with everything Bill Craig says either, but I don't think that one should quickly dismiss his view. That's why I've been trying to steel man it and say, well, here's what I would say in arguing from this position. I've made it clear which position I favor, but I don't think that all Christians have to agree with my position. What I tend to do is I put the options on the table and I explain them. I may express my preference and say, I prefer this one, but there are other options, and make up your own decision.
Yeah, and I think the last thing I'll reiterate before we turn to that actually super exciting bit of
Science
the conversation,
clip.
The science clip, science and philosophy, is I've lost my train of thought. I'm trying to pull it back. Pull it back.
It'll get hungry. It'll come home when it gets hungry.
Yeah, it'll hit me again. Yeah, it'll hit me like while we're in the middle of the science one, but it's okay. We can actually we can turn to that one now, and it's actually toward the beginning of the interview. It happens about 11:25. Let me see if I can get that pulled up quickly here. Here we go. It's actually wanting to start me at the beginning of the chapter that he's actually set up.
That's fine
on his so we're gonna play like a little bit of like a couple seconds of other stuff. But yeah, so here he's talking about science and philosophy. Really interesting clip. Let's play this and then we'll share some thoughts on it.
Craig. Well, if we were to try to present a softer version of the argument, which doesn't conclude so radically that God almost certainly doesn't exist, but rather says something like, we can have a justifiable optimism about the ability of science in many areas, because Dawkins, of course, points to Darwinism as his principal example, but there are lots of areas of science where it appears that there have been explanations wanted for certain cosmic or biological or chemical events that in the past people have, rightly or wrongly, attributed to divine agency, which now, although we may not have removed the ability to have divine agency behind the mechanisms of that the scientific method has revealed, we at least don't have the mystery of what those mechanisms are and how something like biological complexity can arise. And so I think Richard Dawkins has said to me on my podcast that he sees something like a trajectory, that there are many things which we used to not be able to explain that we can now, and there's no reason to think that this won't continue into the future. Just to illustrate this, the way that I think about this is stepping into a time machine and going 100, 200 years into the future, and somebody's watching this conversation back, and they're saying something like, wow, can you believe that they hadn't worked out the fine-tuning of the universe yet? Can you believe they hadn't worked out the science of consciousness yet? Wow, isn't that amazing? But what I can't imagine, and that just seems intuitively plausible that somebody could look back in that way. What I can't imagine, however, is somebody going in that time machine, looking back and making the same comment about the sort of atheist case against God, saying, wow, can you believe it? They hadn't worked out the problem of evil yet. Wow, can you believe it? They hadn't worked out divine hiddenness yet. And so the arguments that I put forward for atheism, like the problem of evil and divine hiddenness, it seems more plausible to me that we can be optimistic that science will overcome the mysteries that are often used in promoting God's existence in a way that philosophy is not going to overcome the philosophical challenges to God's existence.
So before we play Dr. Craig's response, I actually wanted to invite the audience. If you haven't seen this original clip, we are going to play Dr. Craig's response to this, but I just want you to think about, like, how would you have responded to this comment by Alex? Because when I first heard him articulate this, he articulated it in a way that I hadn't really thought about before. And I think when I heard Dr. Craig's response, I think that resonated with me in certain ways. But I thought it was really good to think about. So I want to invite you guys to think about that as well. As okay, Jimmy, now it's your turn to share your thoughts.
Oh, I was going to share thoughts overall. I was going to give my response to Alex. Why don't we hear Bill Craig's response first, and then I'll give mine.
Okay.
Okay, there's a lot to respond to there. I think you're quite right in saying that such a more modest formulation of the argument would indeed be more defensible and plausible. And the conclusion from that argument is that these sorts of quasi-scientific arguments for God's existence are inconclusive, and that therefore one ought not to believe in God on the basis of, for example, design arguments. But that says nothing at all about other reasons for theism. And as for the confidence that you speak of, perhaps as someone coming from the other side, I think that we've already resolved the problem of evil, that the problem of evil places a burden of proof upon the shoulders of the atheist that is so heavy that no one has been able to sustain it. And so I think there's been tremendous progress in the history of philosophy with regard to these anti-theistic arguments. And so I don't think we need to go in a time machine into the future to see the resolution of these objections to theism. I think we've got them right now. But if we did go into a time machine into the future, I would fully expect, Alex, that there will be philosophical questions about nature and the universe that will remain open questions. And I do not have any confidence at all that this is all going to be simply resolved naturalistically. And as I said, I think that Dawkins' confidence on the basis of Darwin's achievement is greatly exaggerated. We can talk about that more if you want to, but I don't think that contemporary evolutionary theory bears that out at all. It's extremely controverted today, and therefore I think provides no good grounds for thinking that all of these difficult questions are about to be resolved.
Yeah,
go ahead.
So I think that Craig said a bunch of really good stuff there, and I agree with him that I think that some of the philosophical. So we've got two issues here: scientific arguments for theism and philosophical arguments against theism. Those are the two things that Alex put on the table. And I think
real quick, he did also mention. He did also mention the science of consciousness. He briefly mentioned that. I didn't actually catch that the first time. But he did mention consciousness, which I thought
I'm going to bring that back. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that was strange, but yeah.
Yeah. So on the philosophical side, he mentioned two arguments like problem of evil and problem of divine hiddenness. And I view divine hiddenness as just a subcase of the problem of evil. Well, at the beginning in the early 20th century and in the mid 20th century, you had, atheists proposing the problem of evil in a much more robust, confident way. The logical problem of evil. There's no way with these simple premises that Christians can get around this. And I think Craig is right that Christians have, to my mind, basically solved the problem of evil. They've defanged it of its. It's not to say it has no force today, but it has much less force than it used to. And its principal appeal is on emotional grounds now. When people suffer, that's when they find this argument, or when they think about suffering, that's when they find the problem of evil plausible. But logically, I think Craig's right. We've already solved it. I also agree with Craig that that if we get in a time machine and go 200 years forward, there will still be mysteries philosophically and scientifically that we don't know the answer to, that will be open questions. Where I would differ from Alex is on his appraisal of the science, because he named several different things and said if we got in a time machine and went 200 years or whatever in the future, we would have a scientific situation where science was no longer able to be used to argue in favor of a Christian worldview because things would have been resolved. And it's in that connection that he mentioned the problem of consciousness, where it's like, oh yeah, could you believe 200 years ago they didn't have the problem of consciousness solved? And so they would make arguments for God's existence based on consciousness and stuff. But now we know that we know everything about consciousness and how it's produced by matter in the brain, and therefore those arguments no longer have plausibility. To his credit, Alex said, and we didn't cover this part in the clip, but to his credit, Alex said, even if he thinks that we can explain everything scientifically, that doesn't mean there's not a God who created the laws of nature. And so that was good on his part. But what I don't have confidence in is that 200 years from now, science is going to go consistently in the direction of naturalism. I can easily imagine that there will be multiple fronts on which we will not be able to explain things naturalistically. A very plausible candidate for one of those, and I'll name three, a very plausible candidate for one of those is the origin of the universe. We may know more about the history of the universe, we may be able to push back, its history further. But in terms of why something exists rather than nothing exists, I don't think we're ever going to get a scientific explanation to that. I think that's a question that lies beyond the domain of science. So I don't think science is going to be able to resolve that. A second example is abiogenesis. Alex is right that we have a good sense of how more complex forms of life can emerge from simpler life forms via random mutation and natural or artificial selection. But I view it as quite plausible that science 200 years from now is not going to be able to explain abiogenesis, in fact, or the emergence of life from non-living matter. You have even evolutionary biologists, some of whom say this is so improbable, it just shouldn't happen, of our size and age. And those guys might be wrong, but they also might be right. And by 200 years from now, it might be a widespread view in the scientific community that there is no mathematical way to have it be plausible that life would emerge from non-living matter in a universe of our size and age. So I could see science going the other way on that and saying, yeah, this is a genuine mystery we can't explain. And we would, 200 years from now, we could understand with even more clarity why the math doesn't work for that. At least that's a possibility. The third example I'll name of seeing science go the other way is the consciousness one, because it is assumed right now in much of cognitive science that consciousness is a product of the brain, that the brain is a generator of consciousness. That has not been proved at all by modern neuroscience. We have no way of saying, okay, you get these chemical signals going between synapses, covering synapses in our brain, and that somehow generates consciousness. You can say that, but we have no scientific explanation for that. This is an assumption. And it's an assumption that is increasingly under challenge, including by research that's being done in one of the newer sciences, parapsychology. And there have been people who have worked with neuroscience and the science of consciousness for a long time, whether parapsychologists or not, who have been advocating the conclusion that we actually have a bunch of scientific evidence indicating that consciousness is not generated by the brain, that the brain is a transducer and a filter for consciousness, but it is not generated by the brain. And based on various scientific findings, like those covered, for example, in the book Irreducible Mind by Edward Kelly, I can easily see 200 years from now it being a settled question. Yeah, the brain's a transducer and filter. It's not a generator. So I understand, coming from the naturalist, materialist perspective that he is, how Alex could just assume that science is going to keep going the way he thinks it is for the next 200 years. But I can actually see a basis for it going the other way.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to try to do my best to share the thoughts that I've got on this. My brain is kind of not doing a good job of collecting thoughts and being able to articulate them today. So I'll do what I can. So I'm going to start with the atheological arguments first, the problem of evil and divine hiddenness. I'm mostly in agreement with you that the divine hiddenness argument is a subset of the problem of evil, and I think that's a very respectable view in the philosophy of religion. A lot of philosophers think that as well. I know that is actually controversial, so some people think that it's not a species, but I tend to agree that it is. There's just too many similarities there. So, and I think I also agree with Dr. Craig to an extent that the problem of evil, if it hasn't been completely solved, then a significant amount of progress has been made toward that end in at least two ways. So one way is that Alvin Plantinga, in his free will defense, has shown that the logical problem of evil, at least the version put forth by J.L. Mackie, has been resolved due to his free will defense. And I know that there are contemporary responses to Plantinga's thesis here, but his overall point is that there's a logical consistency between God's existence and the existence of evil. And he argued that with the free will defense, but there were other attempts at making those propositions compatible as well. But I think probably the most significant progress that's been made on the subject of the problem of evil is what's been labeled as skeptical theism. And skeptical theism is actually, I think, what he doesn't like the term. Dr. Craig doesn't like to use the term skeptical theism, but that's the way that it's referred to in the literature. And basically, skeptical theism is a rejection of an inference that goes, if I can't see a reason that God would have to allow this instance of evil, then God probably doesn't have a reason. That's the inference that skeptical theists are skeptical of. They're skeptical that inference, they call them a no-seeing inference. I can't see it, so it's probably not there. That's the inference that skeptical theists are like, I don't know about that. And that's actually an inference that a lot of atheologians will make. They'll say, well, have you looked around? Have you seen, have you considered the various goods that might justify allowing some evil to occur? There doesn't seem to be one in this, and they'll point to the fawn, burning to death in the woods. There doesn't really seem to be a reason that God would have to allow that to occur. So then the inference is, I can't really see a reason, so probably God has no reason. But skeptical theists have come along and said, well, there's actually a whole bunch of reason to actually expect that we wouldn't be familiar with those reasons. Not only that we wouldn't be familiar with them, but we also may not even be able to acknowledge them. Even if it's come across our path, we may just be in a situation where we don't acknowledge that it is actually the reason that God has for permitting this evil in the world. So I think that response to the problem of evil has made significant progress. It's actually one of the most challenging responses that atheists have come across, and they are all over the place on how to respond to it. Some will argue that it leads to too much skepticism, and then theists have their responses to it. If I can point you in the direction of someone, if you'd like to look into that further, there's a friend of mine. He's been on the channel a few times. His name is Perry Hendricks, and he's sort of like the skeptical theism guy. He's younger. He's got a PhD. He's pretty funny too. I've actually known him for a very long time. He and I were actually active on the Reasonable Faith forums back in like the early 2010s. He went by a different name back then, but anyways, skeptical theism
I use that. I interact with that in my treatments of the problem of evil, but I'd love to learn more about this gentleman. I've just taken down his name.
Perry Hendricks, and his last name is not spelled like Jimi Hendrix. It's spelled CKS.
Okay.
So Perry Hendricks, he's great stuff on skeptical theism, and he's convinced that it's like, it sort of deals a death blow to the problem of evil. And the problem of evil is an argument from atheists, so atheists do have the burden of proof in that argument, and then skeptical theists will just be like, well, you haven't shouldered your burden of proof. And if you've heard Craig talk about like, and he, I think, even mentions it in this clip with Alex, is that atheists just haven't been able to meet their burden of proof here. And I think the skeptical theists have made pretty much a similar point here, is that they'll appeal to this inference, but that inference is not a good inference, and so you can't appeal to it when trying to defend the problem of evil. But then what do you have if you don't have that inference? So I think that the significant amount of progress has been made, and atheists haven't really adequately dealt with that objection. So I think I'm in agreement largely with Dr. Craig on this. Now, that being said, like I some days I'm a skeptical theist, some days I'm not. I think in addition to skeptical theism, I think that there's a really good theodicy that I won't go into much detail here. It's just called soul building. I mentioned it earlier. I think it's a really, really, really solid theodicy that explains why God allows the suffering in the world, and it can be extended to also explain why animals suffer. So there's a lot there, and I think that also is a marker for progress in the philosophy of atheism. Okay, so that was a long-winded way of responding to the atheological point. So on the topic of science and Christianity, and are we going to fast forward 200 years and then science has just revealed all of this knowledge? So one thing I think that's important here to point out is that science, if we can even say that there are such things as scientific explanations, what they do is they appeal to laws of nature in their explanations. So they start with certain conditions, and then they couple that with laws of nature. And once you get those initial conditions and then you let the laws of nature sort of take over, that's what explains what we see in the world. Okay. So scientific explanations require scientific laws or laws of nature in order to even constitute an explanation. But when it comes to something like the beginning of the universe, we're talking about the beginning of these laws. So you can't appeal to some sort of explanation that is appealing to laws that maybe pre-existed those laws. We're talking about the beginning of those laws at all. And there's even a fine-tuning argument that appeals to something similar. So some people think that eventually, like, we're going to explain why the cosmological constant has the value that it does. We're going to explain why the gravitational constant has the value that it does. And we're going to find one sort of unified law that explains these various constants. But that's a separate question from why there are any laws at all in the first place. Why is there a strong nuclear force? Why is there a law of gravity in the first place? And so that question is not going to be explained by science, because science, again, appeals to or uses the laws of nature in order to generate these explanations at all. So if you don't have those, you have no scientific explanation. So science can't, in principle, explain why there are any laws in the first place. So I don't think that that's going to, in 200 years, we're not going to have some scientific explanation why there are any laws of nature, because it's impossible. It's impossible to do that.
I think
I have something else to say, but feel free.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, I think Alex acknowledged that. He said we couldn't eliminate, even if we have all these explanations scientifically for various phenomena in nature, that wouldn't rule out God as the cause of all those laws. Mm-hmm. But it would mean that you couldn't appeal to things like fine-tuning or human consciousness as arguments for God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mentioned that in Robin Collins' contribution to the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, he writes the essay or chapter on fine-tuning, and he presents sort of two types of fine-tuning. So one of them is like the constants, the actual numbers that you plug into the equations when you're thinking about the cosmological constant or the gravitational constant. Those actual numbers, that's one type of fine-tuning. But then the other type of fine-tuning is just the laws themselves. We have to have this specific set of laws finely tuned in order to even have a universe that might permit life. So I think that you could still qualify the laws of nature themselves, like the set of laws that have to exist for life. I think that you could still qualify that as a sort of fine-tuning argument, which would still sort of undercut Alex's point here. But as it relates to consciousness, suppose that we do have the laws, suppose that the scientific laws are there, you might then think, well, we could, at least with respect to consciousness, we could appeal to initial conditions and some set of physical laws of nature that would explain the emergence of consciousness, because in at least the case of consciousness, we're not talking about the origination of the laws. We're just talking about the origination of consciousness. But I think that what you're going to run up against with respect to consciousness is a sort of building problem, or a construction problem, as Josh Rasmussen puts it. So in here, maybe an analogy to think about would be, there's no, like, you can't take so suppose that your initial conditions are a set of blue bricks, and then like there's no set or law of nature that you're going to discover that would then explain how you could arrive at a phenomena of a red brick wall using the initial conditions of blue brick building blocks. Okay, so that's a sort of construction error, that you can't build a red wall from a set or initial conditions of blue building blocks. And so and then the analogy would just be that when it comes to consciousness, when you build from building blocks of like non-mind material, you're not going to be able to arrange those in a certain way and then apply some sort of law of nature that's going to then get you consciousness or something that has a mind, because you have the wrong building blocks to build from. And so I think that's what I think they are going to face. And that's one of the reasons why I don't think that AI is ever going to be conscious, because it's not, you can't build something conscious from non-conscious material or like code or anything like that. It's just impossible because of this sort of construction error. So I think it's a long-winded way of saying that I basically agree with Dr. Craig. I don't think that fast forward 200 years, we're going to have answers to these scientific problems. If you even want to categorize them as scientific, I'd even talked about like the definition of science, because I think, once we actually define what we mean by like a scientific explanation, if we broaden it enough, and I think we should, then we're just going to be talking about philosophy and philosophical arguments. But anyways, long-winded way of saying that I pretty much agree with Dr. Craig here. But it's super interesting stuff to think about.
Yeah.
Any thoughts, or should we wrap things up?
Well, no, I agree. I just think Alex would be surprised. I don't think everything is going to continue to go in science in terms of a naturalistic explanation for everything. I think there is emerging evidence for not everything can be explained naturalistically, and it's actually the opposite. So I can see naturalism, even though it's the dominant philosophy today among scientists, I can see naturalism falling to where it will not be a default assumption in the future.
And I don't think this would, like, we wouldn't categorize this as like a scientific phenomenon or anything like that. That's another thing I like about Swinburne, how he distinguishes between scientific and personal explanations. But like when it comes to miracles, like supernatural miracle accounts and demonic accounts, I actually think that science has no like hope of explaining those accounts, especially like if there is some, say in 200 years we have some exorcism that has been filmed, and we can like verify that the film is like genuine. I know that AI is kind of calling that into question these days, but suppose that we could, like, I can imagine
there are measures
like
now
a miracle or demonic,
Yeah, there are measures now to get around that problem where you have authenticated, like, single source recording unmodifiable video that AI, as long as you've got the provenance, you can show this is not the product of AI. So I think that's a technological challenge that can be solved.
But I guess the point is just that even if science could resolve these other issues, which it can't resolve the construction error, and it can't resolve like why there are any laws or this set of laws in the first place. It can't do that. But then what do you do with like these other things that might pop up, in 100 years, in 200 years? There might be some miracle that's captured on camera. Just like there are some now, like the miracle of Zaytun. So there's already stuff to contend with and deal with that science may be, like you said, naturalism might just be taking a backseat in a couple hundred years. So
yeah, that's something. Actually, before we began the live stream, Russell asked me, what do you say to someone who challenges the idea, like whether parapsychology is really a
Randall.
science?
I don't know who you were referring to. Yeah,
what did I say? What did I say?
You said Russell,
which
I think was a mixture of Randall and Rauser.
That could well be. But anyway, Randall asked me, what do you say to someone who says like parapsychology is not a science? And I answered, I asked the person, have they read any peer-reviewed parapsychological papers because there are journals publishing these. They are genuinely scientific. They have scientific results, and they point in the direction of materialism or materialistic naturalism being false. And as
what are you going to do with that, naturalists?
Yeah, and as I want to say, Max Planck said, science progresses one funeral at a time. So 200 years from now, the naturalists may have had their own personal Darwin Award ceremony, and we may have a completely different scientific paradigm that isn't based on naturalism.
We could also be visited by some alien species that are Christian.
We could. I was also
the naturalist.
I was going to say we could also have aliens come down and just tell the naturalists they're wrong.
Yeah,
that's the thing.
Yeah,
about
which actually
it's hard, especially about
yeah. No, there are some atheists. There's Emerson Green. What is his? Do you know who I'm talking about? Emerson Green.
Yeah, I know him. Yeah.
He's got a great Twitter, and I've met him in person a couple times. He's awesome. But yeah, he talks about the fact that is he agnostic or atheist?
I think he's agnostic, but he is interested in alien stuff and had me on to talk about aliens.
Yes. Yeah. And one of the things that I've seen him mention on Twitter, maybe he mentioned it with you in your interview with him, is that if there were aliens and they believed in God, then he would pretty much become a theist. That would serve as really good evidence for him.
Oh, cool. I just want to make sure that the aliens have a higher IQ than we do.
Yeah. Well, if they were able to make it here, maybe they
might.
And we should refer to them as the official name, ETI, right? Isn't that the
the extraterrestrial intelligence? It's one of them anyway.
More contemporary terms to use.
Yeah.
Jimmy, I mean, I want to talk with you longer, but it's about time to actually pick up the kids from school.
We've been going almost 3 hours.
I know and this is unusual. I mean, I don't typically do live streams this long, but if you guys have been enjoying this content, I plan on bringing Jimmy on as much as possible. So if you like seeing Jimmy on Capturing Christianity, then let me know in the comments, and we'll find more topics and opportunities to have him back on. Maybe he can be a sort of regular face that you guys see on Capturing Christianity. But Jimmy, thanks for joining me. Thanks for coming on, as usual.
My pleasure. And also, I know you have that closing video inviting people to support your channel. And I just want to chime in and say, support Cameron's channel. It's how he makes his money. If you like this content, help him keep doing it.
Yes. We have some big plans. We actually went and looked at some office space yesterday that was amazing. And we may be able to work out a great deal with the business owner there. So a lot of big things in the works. So thank you guys for supporting. As always, you can always subscribe to the channel. That's a free thing that you can do. But anyways, thanks you guys for watching. We'll see you guys in the next video, which coming out Thursday. Let me see if I've got the book here. I think I do. It's here somewhere. I know this is really good to have this much downtime. Let me get it. Okay. It's over here. Mm-hmm. This is what I'm talking about on Thursday with Patrick
The Best
Flynn.
Argument for God.
Have you read this?
No, I haven't.
It's got glowing reviews from all of the smartest philosophers that, Josh Rasmussen, he's actually on the back of it. A lot of people have said really good things about this. So I'm having Patrick on this Thursday to talk about this book. So
I'd ask you what the best argument for God is, but then that would be a spoiler for Thursday. So don't want spoilers.
It would, but I think it's gonna be great. Anyways, thank you guys for tuning in. Jimmy, as always, thanks for being here, and I'll see you guys in the next video. See you guys soon. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. You just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?